In the early hours of Saturday, the 19th of October 2013, a 2-3-year-old man named Ode Edgelor stood at a crowded bar in a dance club in Antwerp, Belgium. The air was thick with the beat of the music and the energy of the crowd. The bartender slid 2 shot glasses across the slick surface of the bar, and Ode expertly scooped them up. He turned, a grin on his face, and handed one to his friend, Kevin Rodriguez Fuentes, who was waiting right behind him. It was Kevin's birthday, and the night was all about celebrating. Ode raised his glass high. Over the thumping bass, he shouted, "Happy birthday," in his native Spanish. Kevin grinned back, and together they tilted their heads back and slammed down the shots. The burn of the liquor was just another part of the night's excitement. Ode was relatively new to Antwerp. He had moved from Spain about 6 months earlier for a great job as a computer engineer. It was a big step, moving to a new country where he didn't know a soul. But Ode was outgoing and friendly, and it didn't take him long to start building a new life. He'd met Kevin at a local beer festival not long after he arrived. They hit it off immediately. Kevin was from the area, so he took Ode under his wing, introducing him to his circle of friends and showing him all the best places to go out in the city. They became close, fast. Back in the club, after the shots, Kevin tapped Ode on the shoulder. He pointed towards the middle of the dance floor, a wide smile spreading across his face. A group of young women, about their age, were dancing together. Without another word, the 2 friends made their way through the crowd and onto the dance floor. From that point on, the night dissolved into a happy, energetic blur for Ode. He went back and forth between dancing with their new friends and heading to the bar for more drinks. He was having an amazing time. It was nights exactly like this that were making Antwerp feel less like a foreign city and more like a real home. But as the hours wore on, he could feel the alcohol catching up to him. He knew that if he stayed much longer, he risked passing out right there. Sometime later, Ode, Kevin, and a few of the new friends they'd met stumbled out of the club's doors and into the cool night air. The city streets were quiet and mostly empty. Ode instinctively pulled his phone from his pocket to check the time. His vision was blurry, and he had to squint, but he could make out the numbers on the screen. It was nearly 4 a.m. It was incredibly late, practically the next morning. He knew it was time to call it a night. He said his goodbyes to the group, wished Kevin a final happy birthday, and then turned to begin the walk home. The next morning, Kevin woke up in his bed with a skull-splitting headache. He blinked his eyes open, his room slowly coming into focus. He let out a sigh of relief. He was home, safe. The last part of the night was a complete fog. He honestly couldn't remember how he'd even gotten back to his apartment. He groaned, rolled over, and fumbled for his phone on the nightstand. It was a reflexive move for anyone after a long night out. He sent a group text to Ode and another friend who had been with them, asking the simple question, "How are you feeling?" The other friend replied almost immediately, complaining about his own hangover. But there was no reply from Ode. At first, Kevin didn't think much of it. Ode had been drinking just as much as he had. He was probably still sound asleep, trying to recover. He figured he'd hear from him later in the day. But the day passed, and still nothing. The sun went down, and Kevin's phone remained silent. By the next day, which was Sunday, October 20th, with still no word from Ode, Kevin's casual concern started to turn into real worry. This was unusual. He decided to call Ode directly. He put the phone to his ear, but it didn't ring. It went straight to voicemail. That meant his phone was either dead or turned off. This small detail sent a jolt of anxiety through Kevin. Ode was always good about keeping his phone charged and was usually quick to respond to messages. 24 hours of silence was not like him at all, not even with the worst hangover. Kevin immediately called the other friend from their group. He asked if he'd heard anything from Ode. The friend said no, he hadn't spoken to him since they all left the club. The worry was now escalating into a quiet panic. Kevin decided he needed to go check on him in person. He got dressed and headed over to Ode's apartment. When he arrived, he found Ode's roommates at home, but Ode wasn't there. The roommates didn't know Ode all that well. They were more just people who shared a living space. They told Kevin that Ode hadn't come home after the birthday party. They just assumed he was crashing at a friend's place for the weekend and hadn't thought anything of it. But for Kevin, this was a huge red flag. Ode would have told him if he was staying somewhere else. They were close friends. He would have been the first to know. The panic was no longer quiet. As he stood there in Ode's empty room, his mind raced, trying to think of any possible explanation. Then, a thought struck him. He remembered that one of their mutual friends, a young woman named Owen, had gone out of town for a wedding. Maybe, just maybe, Ode had made a last-minute decision to go with her. It was a long shot, but it was the only logical explanation he could come up with. He left the apartment and immediately called Owen. He was hoping she would pick up and tell him that Ode was right there with her, that everything was fine. But when she answered, he could hear the panic in her voice, too. It turned out she had also been trying to reach Ode for the past day, calling and texting him nonstop with no response. She was just as worried as he was. The reality of the situation crashed down on Kevin. No one had seen or heard from Ode since he left the group at 4 a.m. to walk home. He was just gone. Kevin felt a wave of helplessness wash over him, but he knew he couldn't just stand there. His friend could be in trouble. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly, and he contacted the police to officially report Ode Edgelor as a missing person. The following day, Monday, October 21st, Kevin found himself sitting in a small, sterile room at the police station across from two detectives from the Belgian National Police's Missing Persons Unit. As they began to ask him questions, the meeting quickly became frustrating for everyone involved. Kevin tried his best to recount the events of the night, but his memory was a haze of blurry images and fragmented conversations. He had been just as drunk as Ode. He felt a deep sense of guilt for not being able to provide more details. But he did manage to recall a few crucial things. He remembered exactly what Ode had been wearing, a gray hooded sweatshirt and a very distinctive black and white checkered scarf. He also knew the specific area of the city where they had been out. But that was about it. When he left the police station, Kevin felt like he had failed his friend. The idea of just going home to sit and wait while the police conducted their search was unbearable. Ode could be hurt somewhere, needing help. He had to do something more. That afternoon, Kevin met up with Owen and a few of Ode's other friends. Together, they printed hundreds of posters with Ode's picture on them. They spent the rest of the day and evening plastering them all over the city on telephone poles, in shop windows, at bus stops. Antwerp was a bustling city, with bars and restaurants open late into the night. Surely someone must have seen a young man in a black and white checkered scarf walking home. People don't just vanish into thin air. Meanwhile, the detectives got to work. Kevin hadn't given them much, but what he did provide was a starting point. Knowing the general location and what Ode was wearing turned out to be incredibly useful. Police began the methodical process of collecting CCTV surveillance footage from businesses and street cameras in the area where Ode was last seen. They painstakingly reviewed hours and hours of footage, looking for a glimpse of that gray hoodie and checkered scarf. It didn't take them long to find him. On one camera, they saw Ode walking alone down a dimly lit side street just as Kevin had described. His distinctive scarf stood out clearly, even on the grainy nighttime footage. The investigators were hoping the footage would show him getting into a taxi, or meeting up with someone, or even just going into a building. But what they saw next made them lean in closer to the monitor. Out of the deep shadows of a doorway, a figure suddenly emerged. The man rushed towards Ode. It was an ambush. The man attacked Ode, and in the brief struggle, he snatched what looked like Ode's wallet from his pocket. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, the attacker took off running, disappearing down the street. The investigators weren't entirely surprised. While Antwerp was a relatively safe city, muggings did happen, especially to people who were visibly intoxicated and walking home alone late at night. It was a disturbing piece of evidence, but it was also a solid lead. But their investigation was about to take a truly bizarre turn. They continued to track O'Day's path through the city's network of cameras. On footage from a different camera, just a few minutes after the first mugging, they saw O'Day again. He had clearly pulled himself together and was still trying to make his way home. He was still walking alone. But then, it happened again. Suddenly, two new men appeared and rushed him. They attacked him, and this time, they took his phone. Then, like the first mugger, they sprinted off into the darkness, leaving O'Day alone on the street once again. The detectives in the room stared at the screen in disbelief. In the span of just a few minutes, O'Day had been mugged twice by 3 different people. None of them had ever seen anything like it. It felt like a scene from a movie, something so unlucky it was almost unbelievable. Now, they had a new set of questions. Were these 3 attackers working together? Was it some kind of coordinated attack? Or was it just a case of extraordinarily bad luck? They didn't know, but they now had a clear objective. The muggers had stolen O'Day's wallet and his cell phone. That meant they could track the credit cards and the phone's data. They hoped this digital trail would lead them directly to the attackers. Once they had the muggers in custody, they believed they would get the answers they needed to find O'Day. The investigators' plan took a few days to execute, but it worked perfectly. They tracked O'Day's stolen credit card and discovered that someone had tried to use it at an ATM in the city. They immediately pulled the surveillance footage from that ATM and got a clear picture of the first mugger. Then, using cell phone tower data, they were able to trace the path of O'Day's stolen phone. By cross-referencing that data with CCTV footage along the route, they managed to identify the other 2 attackers from the second mugging. They now had all 3 men. They were confident that the mystery of O'Day's disappearance was about to be solved. Fast forward to October 29th. It had been 10 long days since O'Day had vanished, and there was still no sign of him. The police brought the 3 muggers in for questioning, interviewing each of them separately. The detectives laid it all out on the table. They told them they had a mountain of evidence: CCTV footage, ATM photos, cell phone data. They knew they were the ones who had robbed O'Day moments before he disappeared. There was no point in denying it. And to their surprise, none of the men did. All 3 of them freely admitted to robbing O'Day. They told the police exactly what they had stolen. But they all insisted on 2 things. First, their attacks were not coordinated in any way. It was a complete coincidence that they had both targeted the same person within minutes of each other. And second, and more importantly, they all swore that they had absolutely nothing to do with his disappearance. They said they just robbed him and ran. That was it. The investigators listened to their stories with deep skepticism. The idea that 3 criminals had randomly and separately mugged the same man, who then coincidentally vanished in a third unrelated incident, seemed almost laughably improbable. It defied all logic. They pressed the men hard, convinced they were lying, convinced they were hiding a much darker secret. But no matter how much pressure they applied, their stories never changed. We mugged him, we ran away, and we never saw him again. The police arrested and held all 3 men on robbery charges. But their primary goal was still to connect them to O'Day's disappearance. They were sure that with enough time, one of them would crack and tell the truth about what really happened to him. But then, another piece of surveillance footage surfaced from a camera further down the street. And this new footage changed everything. It showed O'Day just moments after the second mugging had occurred. And just as the muggers had claimed, the video showed them running away in the opposite direction. More importantly, it showed O'Day alone, dusting himself off for a second time, and then continuing to walk down the street, eventually moving out of the camera's frame. He was alone. To their absolute astonishment, the police had to accept that the muggers might have been telling the truth all along. This meant that after being violently robbed twice, O'Day had simply kept walking through the streets of Antwerp. Their best and only lead had just evaporated. The investigation was back at square one. This new footage also meant that the search area was now much, much larger. They had to search the entire city. In early November 2013, about 2 weeks after O'Day vanished, The Belgian National Police launched a massive search operation across Antwerp. They went back to every bar, club, and restaurant in the area where O'Day had been. They re-interviewed staff and patrons, showing O'Day's picture, asking if anyone remembered seeing him. But everywhere they went, they hit a dead end. No one knew anything. As the days turned into weeks, the focus of the search slowly shifted northward, following the general direction O'Day had been walking when he was last seen on camera. This path was leading them away from the city center and towards the banks of the River Scheldt, a wide, dark river that cuts through Antwerp on its way to the North Sea. On the evening of November 7th, 19 days after O'Day was last seen, a few detectives found themselves standing on the deck of a very unique structure floating on the River Scheldt. It was called the Boat. Earlier that day, police boats had been dragging the riverbed while search dogs patrolled the banks, looking for any sign of O'Day. A visit to the Boat was a necessary part of this river search. The Boat was a massive entertainment venue, a club, a bar, and a high-end restaurant, all built onto a converted ship that was permanently moored in the river. But its main attraction, the thing that drew crowds from all over, was an almost Olympic-sized swimming pool built right into the deck. It gave the incredible illusion of a pool floating on the surface of the river. It was known as the world's largest floating swimming pool, and it was always busy. The detectives hoped that because of the boat's excellent, unobstructed view of the river and the surrounding banks, someone there might have seen something on the morning O'Day went missing. They split up and began interviewing the staff and patrons, asking the same question they'd asked hundreds of times. Did you see a young man wearing a black and white checkered scarf? By now, nearly everyone in the city knew about O'Day's case. His face was on posters everywhere. People were eager to help, trying to recall any small detail that might be useful. But despite their best intentions, no one on the boat had any meaningful information. The investigators left empty-handed and spent the rest of the day watching the fruitless search of the river. On the 19th of November 2013, 1 full month after O'Day's disappearance, his friends and family held public gatherings in both Antwerp and his hometown in the Basque Country of Spain. His family in Spain made it clear this was not a memorial. They were holding on to the hope that O'Day was still alive somewhere. The gathering was a show of love and an effort to keep his story in the public eye. In Antwerp, his friends tried to send the same message of hope. But as 2013 came to a close, that hope was beginning to fade. The police investigation had stalled completely. The 3 muggers were still in custody, but they hadn't changed their stories. The citywide canvass had yielded nothing. O'Day's friends and family began to fear the worst, that the police, with no new leads to follow, would simply give up. But then, in the early summer of 2014, something incredible happened. More than 7 months after he disappeared, O'Day's story suddenly went viral. It spread far beyond Belgium and Spain, capturing the attention of people all across Europe. This was highly unusual. Thousands of people go missing every year, and most cases barely make the local news. But there was something about O'Day's story, the young engineer starting a new life, the unbelievable double mugging, the complete mystery of his vanishing that resonated deeply with people. It felt impossibly tragic. Just as it seemed the official investigation was winding down, a massive public outcry demanded the opposite. People from all over the continent called for the Belgian police. The international support was overwhelming. Poets wrote poems about O'Day. Musicians wrote songs for him. Charity groups organized their own volunteer searches in Belgium. It was as if the world was rallying together with a single voice. Find O'Day. The tipping point came in October 2014, as the first anniversary of his disappearance approached. One of the most famous soccer players in the world, Cristiano Ronaldo, played a match wearing a jersey with images of O'Day on it. The message reached millions. The pressure on the Belgian government became immense, and they responded. The Belgian National Police officially redoubled their efforts, expanding the search to the entire country. They even enlisted the help of Interpol to extend the search into other European nations. Throughout 2014 and into 2015, investigators revisited every lead, re-interviewed every witness, and made regular public announcements to show they were still actively searching. But despite this monumental effort, they found nothing. Ode was still gone. Then, on the 18th of September 2015, nearly 2 years after Ode's disappearance, a strange incident involving the boat would ultimately lead to the answer. The boat itself was essentially a large, flat, floating platform, more like a huge dock than a traditional ship with a deep hull. On that day, the massive swimming pool on its deck started to leak. Because the pool was recessed into the deck, its bottom was submerged just below the surface of the river. A breach in the pool's base caused it to take on water from the river, and the immense weight of it all became too much. The entire swimming pool structure broke away from the main boat and sank to the bottom of the river Scheldt. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the story made local headlines. The boat was a major city attraction. The city quickly began making plans to salvage the sunken pool. On the 11th of February 2016, almost 2.5 years after Ode vanished, the recovery operation began. 2 massive cranes mounted on a barge were brought in. Cables were lowered and attached to the sunken pool. A member of the work crew stood on the barge, watching intently as the cranes slowly, carefully began to lift their heavy load from the riverbed. The water churned as the massive structure was raised. Soon, the top edge of the swimming pool broke the surface. A few workers let out a small cheer. But the crew member on the barge saw something else. Something in the water, caught on the rising structure. At first, he couldn't make it out. He leaned over the side for a better look. His eyes widened in horror. He immediately shouted for the crane operator to stop. The whining of the cranes fell silent. With a shaking hand, the crew member pulled out his phone and dialed the police. After a thorough forensic investigation, the police were finally able to piece together what happened to Ode Ejiofor on that tragic night. At around 4 a.m., on the 19th of October 2013, after leaving his friends, Ode started his walk home. He was mugged twice in rapid succession. After the second attack, he was hurt, scared, and extremely disoriented from the alcohol and the trauma. He tried to continue on his way, but he was lost. Sometime later, he encountered a group of strangers who saw his condition beat up and confused and tried to help him. They offered to call him a taxi, but Ode was so disoriented he didn't even seem to understand them. He just wandered off into the night. By this point, he had walked far off course, ending up near the banks of the river Scheldt, nowhere near his home. At some point, in his drunken and confused state, he got too close to the river's edge. He stumbled, lost his footing, and fell into the cold, dark water. The shock of the icy water may have sobered him slightly, but he was too intoxicated to fight the strong current effectively. The river pulled him along, eventually sweeping him up against the side of the boat. He was trapped there, pinned against the hull by the current, right next to the recessed swimming pool. He was exhausted and too weak to swim away. He struggled to keep his head above water, but eventually, he had no energy left. The current pulled him under the surface and forced him into the small space between the bottom of the swimming pool and the riverbed. He became wedged there, and he drowned. For more than 2 years, Ode's body remained trapped beneath that swimming pool. Thousands of people swam and partied just a few feet above him, completely unaware. It was only when the pool sank and was later raised by the cranes that his body was finally discovered, still entangled with the structure that had hidden him for so long. The 3 men who mugged Ode were ultimately convicted of robbery and each served about 4 years in prison. They were never directly linked to his death. While the authorities concluded that the most likely scenario was a tragic accident where Ode simply fell into the river, they were never able to officially rule out the possibility of foul play. To this day, Ode's parents have called for the investigation to be reopened, still searching for definitive answers and closure for the loss of their son. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of the 23rd of July 2006, a 74-year-old artist named Maurice Agus was standing in Riverside Park in a town called Chester-le-Street in England. And he was not happy. He paced back and forth on the grass, his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the massive, brightly colored structure that was supposed to be his masterpiece. This was supposed to be one of the biggest, most important days of his entire 40-year career. But right now, things were going wrong. The exhibit was called Dream Space, and it was enormous. Imagine something about half the size of a soccer field made of translucent, colored plastic, all inflated to create a sprawling network of interconnected tunnels and domes. The whole idea was for people to walk through it, to get lost in this world of color and light and sound. Maurice had designed it so that visitors could wander from a red room to a blue room to a yellow room, and the changing colors, combined with soft ambient music piped throughout the structure, would create an immersive, almost meditative experience. It was art you could walk into and live inside, if only for a little while. And this was by far the biggest and most ambitious physical exhibit Maurice had ever attempted. It had taken months of planning, a huge amount of money, and a dedicated team to get it built and transported here. Naturally, there had been some issues along the way, some construction hiccups and logistical headaches, but Maurice was sure it would all be worth it. He knew that placing it right in the middle of a popular public park on a summer weekend meant it was going to be seen by a lot of people. This was his chance to bring his art to the masses, to give them an experience they would never forget. But before they could officially open the doors to the public, there was still one more hiccup to deal with, and it was a big one. When Maurice had arrived at the park early that morning, ready for the grand opening, he'd done a final inspection. And his heart sank. He realized that part of his exhibit hadn't been set up correctly. Some sections weren't fully inflated, and more importantly, the anchoring system, the network of ropes and pegs that held the massive inflatable to the ground, wasn't complete. He and his staff immediately got to work, rushing around to fix everything. They had to reinflate certain chambers, adjust the tension on some of the ropes, and add some finishing touches to the exterior to make it look perfect. Maurice was a perfectionist, and he couldn't stand the thought of people seeing his masterpiece in a state that was anything less than flawless. But as he worked, he could feel the pressure mounting. He knew they really, really needed to hurry. Making all these last-minute changes was eating up precious time. They were supposed to open at 10 a.m., and it was already well past that. And Maurice could see with his own eyes the consequences of the delay. A queue was forming at the entrance. People who had already bought tickets online, families with their kids, couples on a day out, they were all lining up, looking at the closed entrance with confusion and a growing sense of annoyance. Maurice could just imagine what they were thinking. What was the holdup? Why weren't they being let inside? And a knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He was terrified that if he didn't get this thing open soon, people would just give up. They'd ask for refunds, they'd walk away, and they would never get to see how amazing his masterpiece truly was. After all his work, all his passion, the thought of it being a failure before it even opened was just devastating. So, at a certain point, Maurice just had to make a call. He stepped back and took a long look at what he and his staff had managed to fix so far. Things were looking better. They had addressed the most obvious cosmetic issues. The structure looked full and inviting. And even though, as a perfectionist, he would have loved to spend another hour or two tweaking things and making absolutely sure every single safety protocol was double and triple checked, he decided that getting Dream Space open right now was far more important. It was good enough. So he turned to his staff, who were still working on securing some of the anchors at the back of the structure, and told them to stop what they were doing. He instructed them to go to the entrance and start letting the visitors in. The masterpiece was finally open for business. A few hours later, around 3:15 inches the afternoon, a 68-year-old woman named Elizabeth Collings walked into that same park. She was with her 14-year-old grandson, and they were just out for a casual stroll. They lived nearby, and it was just the perfect day for it. It was sunny and warm, but a light breeze was blowing, keeping things from getting too hot. Elizabeth was enjoying the simple pleasure of the moment, the wind in her hair, her grandson happily walking beside her. She felt completely at peace. But then, her grandson stopped dead in his tracks. He pointed and said, "Hey, look at that." Elizabeth turned to see what had caught his eye. And there, on the other side of the park, she saw it. This sprawling, vibrant, colorful structure with a huge line of people still waiting to get in, and this soothing, dreamy music drifting out from its open doors. Elizabeth had never seen anything like it. It looked magical, almost like something from another world had landed in the middle of their local park. She thought whatever it was, it looked incredibly intriguing. Her grandson was already excited, practically pulling on her arm to go check it out, and Elizabeth felt a little thrill of excitement herself. "All right," she said with a smile. "Let's go." A few minutes later, Elizabeth and her grandson had bought their tickets and stepped inside the exhibit. And instantly, Elizabeth knew they had made a great decision. The light inside was dim and filtered through the colored plastic walls, making it seem like they were walking through a rainbow. The dreamy, tranquil music surrounded them, and even though it was fairly crowded and a bit warm inside, it still felt remarkably peaceful. Elizabeth could feel the tension in her shoulders just melt away. Her entire body seemed to relax. For the next 10 minutes or so, she and her grandson just wandered slowly from one chamber to the next, taking in the atmosphere, the lights, and the music. They moved from a deep red room into a bright yellow one, and then into a room that was a beautiful, calming shade of blue. There was some light coming in from an adjacent room, which was a sort of brownish orange color, and when the light from that room mixed with the blue of the room they were in, it had this strange, beautiful effect of making the whole space feel like it was a deep, ethereal green. It was, just as the artist intended, a very cool, serene experience. Both Elizabeth and her grandson were completely transfixed, just standing there quietly taking it all in, and it was in that moment, as they stood together in that peaceful blue-green world, that they heard it. A deafening snapping sound, loud and sharp like a giant whip cracking right next to their ears. The moment the sound hit, Elizabeth suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented. As she stared at the colors around her, the whole room seemed to tilt sideways. She stumbled a few steps, trying to regain her balance, feeling like the floor was moving beneath her feet. At first, she wondered if maybe the heat and the strange lights were just getting to her, making her feel faint. But then she was overcome by an almost floating sensation, a feeling of impossible lightness, as if the room itself was pulling away from the ground. And then she had the terrifying realization that her feet were no longer touching the floor. Outside, Maurice Agis, the creator of Dreamspace, was mingling with the guests who were still in line. And from his perspective, the day had turned into a huge success. After the stressful morning, everything was going great. He had managed to get the last-minute fixes done just in time, and now hundreds of people had come to see his work. There were still at least 40 or 50 people in the queue, with more joining all the time. And best of all, every single person who came out of the exhibit was beaming. They were telling their friends what an incredible, amazing experience it was. The day had been saved. Maurice was filled with a sense of pride and relief. It was all going perfectly. Until he heard that snapping sound. When that loud crack echoed across the park, everyone heard it. Maurice was looking away from Dreamspace at that moment, talking to a visitor. But then he heard screams coming from behind him. He whipped around, and his brain couldn't immediately process what he was seeing. All he saw were these dark shapes just falling out of the clear blue sky, one after another, smashing into the ground with sickening thuds. For a split second, Maurice and everyone else around him were just frozen, trying to understand what these falling objects were. And then, with a wave of absolute horror, Maurice realized what he was looking at. Those shapes were people. So, let's go back to that morning, to that frantic rush to get the exhibit open. Maurice knew this was probably going to be his last big art exhibit. At 74, this was his grand finale, the exclamation point on a long and storied career. He was so worried, so completely terrified, that if he didn't get the doors open fast enough, the waiting crowd would leave, the day would be a failure, and his masterpiece would be remembered as a flop. And so, in his panic, he made a catastrophic decision. He essentially stopped his staff from finishing all the necessary work, overriding their process in favor of just getting people in the door. And the way he rationalized it to himself, and probably to his staff, was that he was just being a perfectionist. He told himself that he would have times liked, times to have done all the fixes, but that he had done times enough. He told himself it was good enough, and that was all that mattered. But the problem was, it wasn't good enough. Some of the things he overlooked, the things his staff were in the middle of doing when he told them to stop, were not just cosmetic touches. They were vital safety precautions. The most critical of these missed safety steps involved tying down a series of extra ropes to anchor the massive exhibit securely to the ground. The staff, following standard procedure, had already tied down the front of the structure, the part that was most visible to the public and the entrance. But because Maurice rushed them to get the place open, they hadn't finished anchoring the back of the exhibit. They had the ropes, they had the heavy-duty pegs, but they were told to leave them and go man the entrance instead. This would turn out to be a fatal oversight. You see, Dreamspace was not a regular, permanent building. It wasn't made of brick and concrete with a real foundation. It was, in essence, a gigantic, intricately designed, bouncy castle. It was an inflatable structure made of thin sheets of PVC plastic, the same kind of material shower curtains are made of. And even though it was a beautiful, calm day with just a light breeze blowing through the park, that was all it took. A sudden gust of wind, nothing out of the ordinary for the area, swept across the park and hit the unanchored back wall of the Dreamspace structure. Because the back wasn't tied down, the wind got underneath it and acted like a giant sail. The entire half a soccer field-sized structure was lifted violently into the air. The few anchors at the front, which were never designed to hold the full force of the structure on their own, snapped instantly. That was the deafening cracking sound that everyone heard. And so, in a heartbeat, this place of serenity turned into a giant, uncontrollable hot air balloon. Everyone inside, dozens of people, including Elizabeth and her grandson, were suddenly and violently thrown around as they were lifted 30 feet into the air. They were all trapped inside this twisting, contorting plastic bubble with no way to get out and no way to control it. As the wind picked up and pushed the structure higher and higher, the violent movements began to tear the plastic seams apart. The structure, as it writhed in the air, began to literally eject the people who were trapped inside of it. They were spit out of the torn holes and fell from a height of 30, 40, even 50 feet, crashing down onto the hard ground below. And that is why, when Maurice turned around, he saw all those people falling from the sky. The scene on the ground was one of absolute chaos and horror. People were screaming. The once peaceful park lawn was now littered with the injured and the dying. First responders rushed to the scene, but it was a nightmare. In the end, 27 people were seriously injured. Many suffered broken bones, head injuries, and severe trauma. And 2 people were killed. One was a 38-year-old radiographer named Claire Firmage. The other was 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings. Her grandson, who had been standing right beside her, survived the fall but was severely injured and had to witness his grandmother's final moments. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. It was led by the UK's Health and Safety Executive, or HSE. When their investigators arrived, the deflated remains of Dreamspace lay like a dead creature on the grass. The first thing they did was walk the perimeter of where the structure had been, and it didn't take them long to find the flaw. They immediately noticed the series of heavy-duty anchor points at the back of the site that had no ropes attached to them. They saw the giant metal pegs designed to be hammered deep into the earth, lying unused on the grass. It was the smoking gun. This wasn't an act of God, it was a failure of procedure. Next, they interviewed the members of Maurice Agis's staff. And one by one, the distraught crew members told the same story. They confirmed that they had been in the process of securing all the tethers that morning. They told the investigators that they were fully aware that all the anchor points needed to be used, especially on a structure of that size. But they all said they were told to stop by Maurice himself. They recounted how he was stressed, how he was panicked about the growing queue and the delay in opening. They admitted they were instructed to leave the back anchors unsecured and to prioritize getting the doors open for the paying public. Some of the staff members even said they had felt uneasy about it at the time, but he was the artist, he was the boss, and they did what they were told. Investigators also pulled the meteorological reports for that day, and what they found made the situation even more tragic. While it had seemed like a beautiful, calm day to the average person in the park, The official weather forecast had included a warning. It specifically mentioned the possibility of sudden strong gusts of wind for that afternoon. It was a predictable weather event, not a freak tornado that came out of nowhere. Anyone responsible for securing a structure the size of a small building should have been aware of that forecast and taken extra precautions. Instead, the person in charge had taken fewer. So, the investigators were able to reconstruct exactly what happened. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was a chain of decisions that led directly to disaster. Maurice Aegis, driven by his artistic ego and the financial pressure of his big day, made the conscious choice to cut corners on safety. He saw the waiting crowd and feared failure more than he feared the potential consequences of his haste. He willfully ignored the concerns of his own staff and, likely, the weather warnings for the day. That predictable gust of wind came, and it hit the structure at its weakest point, the unanchored rear wall. The force was immense, far too much for the few tethers at the front to handle. They snapped, and Dreamspace was launched. The chaos that followed, the fall, the injuries, the deaths of Claire Firmage and Elizabeth Collings, all of it was the direct result of that one decision made hours earlier, the decision that it was good enough. Maurice Aegis was arrested and eventually charged with gross negligence manslaughter for the 2 deaths. The case went to trial, and it was complex. The prosecution laid out all the evidence found by the HSC. They argued that Aegis, as the creator and operator of the exhibit, had a clear duty of care to his visitors, and that he had failed in that duty in the most catastrophic way possible. They portrayed him as a man who put his pride and his profits ahead of people's lives. But his defense team argued that this was simply a tragic accident. They painted Maurice as a passionate artist, not a safety engineer. They claimed he had relied on his team to handle the technical aspects and that he couldn't have possibly foreseen the terrible consequences of a light breeze. The first trial ended with a hung jury. They couldn't reach a unanimous decision. So, a second trial was held. And this time, the jury came back with a verdict. They found Maurice Aegis not guilty of manslaughter. There was an audible gasp in the courtroom from the families of the victims. However, the jury did find him guilty of a lesser charge, a serious health and safety violation. For a breach that led to 2 deaths and dozens of injuries, his punishment was a fine of £10,000. This was later reduced to just £2,500 on appeal after his lawyers argued that he was an elderly man with no savings. For the families of Elizabeth Collings and Claire Firmage, the verdict was an insult. It felt like there had been no real justice for their loved ones. But despite the light legal punishment, what happened that day completely destroyed Maurice Aegis. He may have avoided a prison sentence, but he was a broken man. The public backlash was immense, and his reputation as an artist was left in ruins. But more than that, he was haunted by the knowledge that his creation, his beautiful dream space that was meant to bring people peace and joy, had instead brought them terror and death. He was so devastated by the destruction his masterpiece had caused that he never made anything like it again. He retreated from the art world entirely. This was the last piece of art he ever did. And in fact, he died just 3 years later in 2009. In the end, 2 families were left with an empty space that could never be filled. A day that began with the simple, happy decision to take a walk in the park ended in an unimaginable and completely avoidable tragedy. It all came down to a few unused ropes and pegs lying on the grass and a man who, in a moment of pressure, decided that the show must go on, no matter the cost. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 2006, Susan Lewis and her daughter Jamie discovered the perfect Southern California home in a quiet community. They immediately loved the modest, perfectly sized house. Their home was a haven where they could start a new life. Matt, Susan's new boyfriend, joined them shortly after they moved there, improving things. It started a blended family. Matt and Jamie got along well, which relieved Susan. Matt also had a daughter, Marie, Jamie's age. Immediate friendship formed between the girls. Everything was wonderful briefly. Susan and Matt were happy, the daughters were happy, and this little house was the shelter they needed. This idyllic family started a new chapter. That ideal picture was about to be shattered, starting with a jar of peanut butter. Matt, Jamie, and Marie were enjoying the pool on a sunny summer day a few weeks after everyone had settled in. They were laughing, splashing, and having fun. Susan took a break from the festivities to make lunch for everyone inside. As she entered the kitchen, she spotted it. The kitchen counter had a peanut butter jar on its side. A lid was off. Not the strangest part. Peanut butter poured out of the jar like a liquid. As if melted, it gently oozed across the countertop and dripped into the floor. Susan felt the kitchen air. It was warm, but not hot enough to melt peanut butter. Her first thought was that a child did it. Maybe they came inside, microwaved the peanut butter for some odd reason, and left it as a prank. Anger drove her to the rear door to call for her daughter. "Jamie, get in here!" Jamie, still dripping from the water, entered bewildered. "What, Mom?" she asked. Susan pointed to the counter mess. Jamie later said she chuckled at her mom's silly question. "Did you do this?" "Why would I?" she asked. Susan asked, "Well, I don't know." "Do you know if Marie did this?" Jamie shakes her head. "No, we've been outside the whole time." Susan sent her outside and called Marie, believing her daughter. Like Jamie, Marie was confused as she entered. She replied, "No, I didn't touch the peanut butter." Susan looked from the mess to the two innocent girls. She sighed. She thought one of them wouldn't admit it, but it was a lovely day and she didn't want a spilled jar of peanut butter to ruin it. It was rationalized in her head. One of the youngsters may have knocked it over accidentally and been too scared to admit it. It may have melted because the kitchen was warmer than she thought. She convinced herself there were a dozen rational answers. It turned out she didn't care enough to make a big deal. Susan returned outside after 10 minutes of cleaning up the sticky, oily mess, and the four of them spent the afternoon in the sun and pool. Once the sun fell, they headed inside. The moment they entered, they sensed something was seriously wrong. After leaving, the house was different. Cans of pantry food were stacked on every second-floor stairwell. Some beans, maize, and soup cans were stacked haphazardly, forming a quiet obstacle course. But it continued. Random objects in odd patterns littered the house as they entered. Shampoo and conditioner bottles were arranged in a teetering pyramid on the tub edge. They had a flawless star pattern of hairbrushes and combs on the counter. They opened the microwave and found several peanut butter jars, some vegetable cans, and even some of the girls' teddy animals. The cleaning materials were neatly lined up on the floor under the kitchen sink, from shortest to tallest. Next came walls. Sprayed and splattered strange liquids covered the living room and kitchen walls. It looked like ketchup, mustard, or other sauces, but they weren't sure. Shampoo and soap stains made the walls slimy and sticky. Their immediate impression was that an intruder had broken into their home and robbed them. They hurried back outside, hearts racing, and searched the land. But nobody was there. Nobody had entered the residence all afternoon. They would have seen a car or person enter their driveway. Confusion and fear led them to capture what they saw. They returned inside and took pictures and videos of the unusual scenes on their phone. This is why we have so many photos today. None of it made sense to them. Their thinking told them this was a hoax, but who would pull it? Jamie was suspicious by Matt immediately. He assumed his non-biological daughter was behaving out. Susan thought it was Marie, Matt's daughter. Matt and Susan had a terrible fight over this quick blame game. It started a serious breakup in a nice blended family, and things became worse. Try to imagine their situation. Parents don't want to believe in supernatural events. Some kid is responsible, which is the most plausible but painful answer. If it's not a child, a stranger was in your home touching your things. What if it's not an intruder? The idea was too terrible to consider. So they believed the other person's child was guilty. They were convinced beyond reason. This conviction and need to blame someone prevented them from calling the police, which they should have done immediately. That call never happened. Instead, they began the laborious cleanup. They spent hours cleaning up the house while a dense, seething stillness permeated the air. After finishing, they sought to go on like denial-stricken folks. However, their sanctuary's weird events continued. About a week passed. The house was still tense, but they were attempting to forget the can and sauce incident. Jamie and Marie tried to spend time together one afternoon in Jamie's room. Marie worked on homework at a desk next to the bed. Jamie poured her freshly brewed coffee on the desk next to Marie. "I have to go use the bathroom. I'll be right back," she added. She turned and left the room, disappearing for a while. Marie returned with her head down, looking preoccupied with studying. Jamie returned into the room and discovered the coffee cup gone from the desk. Her white bedspread was covered in dark brown coffee when it was thrown. The room was empty except for Marie. Jamie became furious. "Marie, what are you doing? Why did you throw my coffee all over the bed?" Marie looked up from her schoolwork, stunned. She asked, "What are you talking about?" After following Jamie's gaze to the bed, she appeared as astonished as Jamie. "I didn't do that," she said. Jamie didn't trust her. This seemed like another of her odd tricks to garner attention, as she still believed Marie had made the large mess in the house the week before. Jamie left the room for cleaning supplies, frustrated. Her bleach bottle was placed on her dresser when she returned. Open dresser drawers held her clothes. She placed the bleach bottle upright on the smooth wood. She then took up the empty coffee mug from the bed and put it on the desk. She froze when she turned to grab bleach. She was spilling bleach over her clothes in her open drawers because the cap had been unscrewed. A constant flow of transparent, corrosive liquid ruined everything. Jamie could see Marie sitting on the chair the whole time. She remained still. Jamie was convinced it wasn't Marie. She screamed. Marie screamed when she saw bleach everywhere. Susan ran inside the room after hearing the noise, screamed, "What's going on in here?" The frightened girls tried to explain what happened, but their statements were inaccurate. A wall-mounted picture frame tumbled to the floor as the three of them stared at the damaged garments. It startled them all. Another picture fell after they stared at the empty wall. A loose nail or poster dropping could be a coincidence. However, two photographs descending simultaneously felt different. Susan witnessed the photos falling, the bleach and coffee, and her daughter and stepdaughter's utter terror. She grabbed both females and they fled. They hurried out of the home, got in the car, and drove away without a destination. They realized they couldn't stay in that house. A huge plot twist occurred. Jamie and Marie had silently accused each other of the strange events until now. Though they never stated it, it helped them make sense of the turmoil. Susan had been mentally blaming one or both girls. Now that she had seen the portraits come off the wall, Susan was beginning to suspect that something supernatural was happening in their home. Jamie and Marie were convinced. They were the first to express it as they drove aimlessly. They suspected their home was haunted. Susan and the girls drove home when they calmed down. Matt was at work all day and didn't know what happened. They returned inside with heavy hearts. The house failed again. Cans stacked up the stairs, stuff in unusual patterns on the floor, the microwave was filled of various goods, and the refrigerator door was open, spilling food onto the kitchen floor. Strange, sticky liquids covered the walls again. No one was responsible this time. Susan, Jamie, and Marie spent the entire vehicle ride together. Matt wasn't home, so none of them were it. Their terror was heightened by this fresh proof, coffee, bleach, and falling photos. The concept of a haunted house became unsettling. Matt returned home that night to turmoil and 3 worried family members. Instead of worrying, he got more persuaded that this was a prank. He hadn't seen the bleach pour alone, not seeing the images fall from the wall. All he saw was his girlfriend, Susan, believing this crazy claim that their house was haunted. Matt was a skeptic and refused to entertain any other explanation other than his girlfriend's trick. He and Susan had a huge fight. He claimed she encouraged the youngsters' imaginations. She said that he didn't comprehend and that the house was broken. They yelled at each other. They cleaned the house again while fighting, taking forever. The idyllic family was shattered at the end. Susan and Matt loathed each other, the kids were squabbling, and their sanctuary was gloomy and oppressive. Things worsened that night. The house lost power instantly. They were plunged into darkness and heard doors banging open and shut all night. The electric ignition on their stove kept clicking, as if trying to light a burner. They couldn't turn it off. Bang, 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 click, click all night. They saw all this paranormal activity and recorded part of it, but fear and unbelief paralyzed them. Nobody knew what to do. From the outside, it's simple to suggest they should have contacted the police or left the house. However, a situation like that upends your universe. This challenges all you thought you knew about reality. Your brain switches on denial to cope. Instead of uniting against whatever was in their house, they fought and blamed each other for the things that were clearly happening in front of them, things that had nothing to do with them. Susan, Matt, and the girls hadn't notified their friends or relatives yet. They were humiliated and afraid of being disbelieved. Susan finally snapped the next day. She told a close friend everything. Peanut butter, cans, bleach, smashing doors. Her friend listened carefully and gave odd advice. Maybe you should try giving it a peace offering, she added. Maybe this thing in your house feels like you're intruding on its space. If you offer it something to show you mean no harm, that you want to coexist, maybe it'll stop. Whether this advice was good or not, Susan felt in control for the first time. She embraced the notion. Matt would be at work that day, so she knew he would never approve. It would start another fight when he called it absurd. So she saw an opening. She told the girls the plan. Susan chose a little porcelain cat figurine for the offering. Cats were her passion, so she thought offering them would be powerful. She said, "We mean no harm. Let's call a truce." She set up a little table with candles and a cat figurine in the middle. Observing her, the females were unsure what to think. Susan talked from the heart since she didn't know what to say or how to ritualize. "Please accept this gift," she told the empty room. "It's my gift to you. We mean no harm, and we want to coexist." Fate brought Matt home quickly. The noise had kept him up the night before, and he was so sick and fatigued that he left work early. He entered his house and observed Susan and the girls performing a seance. He was mad. "Definitely not," he said. "We are not going to interact with this thing. We're not going to act like it's real, because it's not." He stepped to the table and saw the cat figurine was the focus. Susan and the girls begged him, "Don't do anything! Don't touch it!" But Matt ignored them. He grabbed the figurine from the table, went to the back deck, and flung it into their backyard. Susan and daughters cried. He had made things worse, and they were afraid. All eyes were on the backyard where the cat landed. But they turned and glanced at the table. They all gasped. The same cat figurine was in the middle of the table where it had been seconds earlier. It was impossible. Everyone had seen Matt chuck it. Matt refused to change. He didn't care. He ran back over, grabbed the new figure, and tossed it on the floor, shattering it into 100 pieces. The violence and aggression were the reverse of Susan's peace offering. At that moment, Susan felt a sickening feeling in her stomach and knew they would suffer for what he had done. Jamie woke up in the middle of the night after everyone had wept themselves to sleep. She discreetly went downstairs to the kitchen for water because she was thirsty. Her blood chilled when she entered and turned on the light. The kitchen walls were covered in ketchup-like writing that repeated one word: cat. She saw cat everywhere. She shouted and went upstairs, waking everyone. Everyone descended and saw the signs. Matt instantly faced Jamie. "You're the one that found this." "You did this," he said. Susan defended Jamie. "You're the one who smashed the cat figurine, Matt." "No wonder this is happening." It escalated into another terrible brawl, with everyone screaming and blinded by rage and terror. They were haunted and could only pull each other apart. Beyond the writing on the walls, the residence was looted again. The contents of every drawer were spilled on the floor. Every closet was open, clothes scattered. Extremely messy, unlike anything they had seen before. Nobody had woken up. Everyone slept in their beds and heard nothing. It wasn't rational. As they began another unpleasant kitchen cleanup, they shifted some objects and found something new. A large, muddy footprint was on the linoleum floor. It was bigger than Matt's foot and not Susan's or the girls'. It was a giant man's footprint, or something else. Again, we can easily ask why they didn't go. When in chronic turmoil, your brain craves normalcy. A coping method. They did nothing. They cleaned up the debris, washed cat off their walls, and tried to survive in a house they couldn't afford to leave. Family dynamics had collapsed by this stage. The kids were shy and terrified. Marie and Jamie stayed in their rooms all day. Matt and Susan barely spoke. The house was now a jail, and everyone was sad. In the last 2 weeks of their time in that residence, 2 frightening events forced them out forever. Marie experienced it first. One evening, she was home alone for 2 hours. Susan and Matt hated leaving her, but they had to. Jamie went out with buddies. As night fell, Marie was home alone. Similar to a horror film scene. TV was her distraction in the living room. TVs started turning off and on suddenly. Fast, rhythmic, on, off, on. She understood from experience that this was a terrible sign indicating trouble. She couldn't turn the TV back on after it fully switched off. The remote flew off the coffee table and skidded across the floor as she reached for it. She was stuck in fear, sitting there. She knew others were there. She then watched in terror as the empty rocking chair in the corner of the room started rocking slowly, then more vigorously, as if an invisible person had just sat down and was watching her. Marie watched the rocking chair as the portraits on the walls fell to the floor one by one. Marie and Jamie started carrying a digital camera around to chronicle weird events. Marie grabbed her camera while scared on the couch. With shaking hands, she aimed it around the room and started taking shots, trying to capture something. She ran for her phone and called Susan, her dad, and anyone who answered. She said, "You have to get here now." "Something's happening!" Susan and Jamie ran home to find Marie huddled on the couch, scared but unharmed. The house was thrown again. After things calmed down, Marie remembered the camera. "I took pics," she stated. The small computer screen displayed her images, which they viewed together. She appeared in numerous photos with weird, dazzling orbs of light in the living area. Their movement around the room was obvious. It proved something was there. It was the last straw for Matt. He could no longer deny it. Pictures showed his daughter was terrorized. He eventually believed their home was haunted. The church was his first stop because he didn't know who to call. He contacted priests and pastors to invite guests to the house. He could only get one priest to pray with the family for a few minutes before declaring, "I can't help you," and leaving. They were alone in a house they couldn't afford to leave, with a growing threat. Jamie's second major event, which broke them, occurred at home alone. In her bedroom, she heard a loud door hammering. Thump, thump, thump. Nobody else was home, she knew. Fearful, she grabbed her camera and filmed the door, recording her frightened breaths. Someone was repeatedly knocking on her bedroom door. She knew she had to check the hall. She moved toward the door, her heart racing, gathering the confidence to turn the handle. The beating on the other side stopped when her hand approached the doorknob as if it knew what she was about to do. The beating resumed when she retracted her hand. She went back to her bed and curled up in the fetal position for 3 hours, listening to somebody bashing her door. The banging ceased abruptly. Jamie believed she could depart the house after a few minutes of silence. She crept back to the door, cautiously turning the knob and opening it. The hallway was vacant. No one was there. When she peered outside her door, she saw a huge dent in the wood where the pounding had occurred. It appeared that a huge force had bent the hallway doorknob downward. A filthy mound of pots, pans, silverware, and knives covered the hall floor. It appeared that something was trying to smash her door with tools. The doorknob to the restroom next to her room was gone, leaving a space where you could look through. They hadn't replaced it yet. The bathroom light flickered as Jamie stood in the corridor. It's in there, she thought. In an odd flash of boldness, she decided to trap it. She hurried back to her desk, grabbed thread, and returned to the restroom door. She threaded the string through the doorknob hole, closed the door, and leaned back, thinking she had trapped it. When the door closed, she sensed resistance. Something was retreating. An invisible pull tugged at her. She fell backwards into her room when the string snapped. Bathroom doors crashed open. She imagined she would meet whatever was frightening her family. She was trapped in her bedroom when her bedroom door banged before she could see anything from the bathroom. She heard pans rustling and metal clinking outside her door. It interacted with its hallway tool pile. She noticed smoke enter her room from under the door after a moment. She went to the door and threw it open. She observed a frying pan with a burned roll of toilet paper in the hallway. Like a fuse, toilet paper was scattered along the corridor. This creature tried to burn the hallway. She was now completely survival-oriented. It now wanted to kill her, not terrify her. She used a hoodie from her room to extinguish the pan fire. She carefully crossed the corridor, tearing away the toilet paper, preparing to face this dreadful thing at any moment. She entered the living room and spotted toilet paper, paper towels, and newspapers. Her house was prepared to burn down with her inside. She hurried out the front door after navigating the maze of flammable items, searching for other fires. She sobbed on the front steps and waited for her family to come home. Jamie was screaming violently on the steps when Susan, Matt, and Marie returned. They ran inside, saw the toilet paper and burn marks, and Jamie recounted what happened. The end. That ended it. They knew to leave. They couldn't afford to move and knew it would ruin them, but they had no alternative. They packed only what they needed and left the house and its contents. House never sold. Susan went bankrupt. Strange things happened after they went. Next-door neighbors moved. The neighboring household moved. 5 nearby households pack up and leave. Not one of their homes sold. They remain empty, and no one knows why. Even though they were broke, Susan, Matt, Jamie, and Marie were glad to leave. Since leaving that house, they never experienced any paranormal activity again and are happy they survived. 911 dispatchers are prepared to handle banal and alarming calls. But Reno, Nevada dispatchers may have received the creepiest 911 calls ever. An elderly couple resided in a modest house 20 miles east of Reno. In 2010, her spouse died, leaving her alone at home. She started calling 911 twice or 3 times a week following his death. She didn't call for emergencies. She asked for things like, "Can you please put some water on to boil for my tea?" and "Could you come over and change the thermostat? It's a bit chilly." The dispatchers knew she had dementia. They always talked gently and told her 911 was for emergencies. She always seemed to understand, apologize, and hang up. These calls were confused and not emergencies, therefore first responders were never sent to her house. No matter how many times they explained it, she continued phoning. Her calls changed eventually. Instead of asking for help with routine domestic tasks, she called 911 thinking she was talking to her deceased husband, John. Dispatchers would answer the phone and hear her say, "John? Where are you? John, please come home." By now, they were so familiar with her that her address would appear up on their screen and they knew who it was. A protocol governed her calls. They answered politely and repeated their script. "Ma'am, this is 911. You can't call this number unless it's an emergency. You need to talk to your family." They didn't send a response unit again because she sounded confused, not in danger. Her tone changed when her number called one day. She sounded panicked and afraid. "John, please come home." "Help me." "I need help, John. Come home." Her worried cry prompted the dispatcher to send first responders to her house for a welfare check. A few minutes later, the responding police unit pounded loudly on her front door and called her name. No response. Complete silence filled the house. The door was unlocked when they turned the knob. After identifying themselves as police, they entered. They immediately noticed how cold the house was. It was obvious the heat was off. They checked the first level but couldn't find her. No struggle or unusual behavior was observed. They walked upstairs to examine rooms. Each room was unoccupied until the master bedroom. The elderly woman was on the bed when they opened the door. Her death was obvious. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body after death, made her look dead for hours. The officers confirmed that the woman on the bed was the house owner and 911 caller. They updated the dispatch center by calling back. They told the dispatcher, "The woman you said made that 911 call a few minutes ago. It couldn't have been her. Based on the state of the body, she was already dead at the time that call was made." But the dispatchers insisted. "No way," they said. "We know what she sounds like. We talk to her multiple times a week. We have a whole procedure for her. The call that led you to that house was made by her." It was her voice. Police and dispatchers debated the discrepancies. They reached a rational conclusion. Not real rigor mortis, they decided. Her house was frigid, making her stiff. They assumed she called 911 and died in the few minutes it took officers to arrive. It was a reasonable explanation, but everyone was a little scared. A few days later, 911 was called again. The dispatcher noticed the deceased woman's home address on the screen. Double take. It wasn't possible. They assumed a relative or friend was at the house. Blood chilled when the dispatcher answered. It was her. She screamed for her spouse in the same voice. "John, come here! Save me! Help me!" The dispatcher followed procedure and stayed calm despite knowing the whole background and that this woman was supposed to be dead. The call ended abruptly when they tried to acquire further information from her. They sent a crew to inspect the house since they had no other choice. Responding cops returned to the property. Knocked on the door. No reply. The door was unlocked from their last visit. The house was empty when they entered. Nobody there could have made that call. At this moment, the dispatch center suspected a terrible trick. The next day, it happened again. Another call from the dead woman's home. The same frantic voice begged for her spouse and for aid when they picked it up. The dispatcher tried to keep her on the line again, but it cut out. They sent officers again after a 911 plea for help. Another unoccupied house greeted the cops. As before, she received calls many times a week. Vandals broke into and burnt her empty house, but they continued. It was a burnt-out lot with no house, but 911 calls came from that location. Finally, police told the phone company about the strange scenario. The phone company examined its records and found that the woman's line was cut nearly immediately after her death. However, they told the police that the number may have been functional because the line was possibly not severed correctly at the spot. So they sent a lineman to inspect the property. The lineman checked the connections at the burned-out lot and reported that everything was correctly removed. The phone company suggested another option. Maybe a digital recording of her voice got stuck in their system and was arbitrarily sent to 911. The dispatchers rejected this idea. They stated it didn't sound like a loop. She always yelled for her husband to save her, but her voice changed. Her voice, accent, and terror level were different every time she called. As there was no clear cause, the dispatch center had to treat every call as an emergency. They got ghost calls many times a week for a year. Every time, they had to send police to check on a vacant, burned-down lot, knowing no one was there. Finally, exactly 1 year after the woman died, the calls ceased. They never got another. The calls weren't a threat, therefore the cops didn't investigate. Very strange. The official explanation for a dead woman calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent residence for a year is, we don't know. Dave Murphy was a young Salt Lake City police officer in 2006. His first job was providing physical security for government sites as a protective service officer. The Capital City Theater, a Salt Lake City institution since the early 1900s, was Dave's first assignment. Dave started working at the theater in early August. There, he met his partner, Morgan Matthews, an experienced officer. Dave later said Morgan was business from the start. Though cordial, he was frigid. Morgan escorted Dave first to the control room on the first floor of the three-story theater. There was a vast basement below the structure. All the theater's security cameras were monitored in the control room. The cameras were ancient and low quality. At night, most lights were off, so you could only see the screen if a light was on. Morgan told Dave they had to conduct their rounds after the quick control room tour. "This is what we do at the beginning and end of every shift," he said. "We walk the entire building, make sure every door is locked and every light is off." Morgan took Dave to the basement. Dave was amazed by its size when he saw it for the first time. The lengthy hallway seemed to go on forever into the darkness. A piano sat alone in this big, empty hall. Poor lighting and musty air were down there. Dave recalls feeling creeped out immediately. The dark hallway with closed doors and the piano in the middle was disturbing. "I don't want to spend much time down here," he thought. After inspecting each door, they returned up the corridor to examine the first, second, and third floors. The rest of their shift was spent in the control room after the security round. Dave wanted to get to know his new partner, but Morgan was icy and uninterested in small talk. Dave observed Morgan seemed nearly frantic to finish the last rounds and leave the building as their shift ended. After that first night, Dave had a peculiar sense that Morgan hated the theater. It took Morgan a while to explain why he was right. Dave's training included security rounds with Morgan over the next 2 days. Morgan concluded 2 days after Dave started that Dave knew the building well enough to tackle the final rounds alone on August 9. "Morgan, why don't you take this one?" Dave felt confident and patrolled the scary basement. After locking the doors and turning out the lights, he checked the first floor's rooms, including the main auditorium. He went to the second floor to examine the rooms and balcony, then to the third floor for the staff offices. He finished his checklist with the practice room. This open doorway was the only room in the building without a door. Just pop your head in, look around, and leave. Dave went to the rehearsal room, turned on the light, and looked in. The room was vacant. Once satisfied, he turned out the light and turned back into the corridor to go when a door across the hall banged shut violently. It was the bathroom door. His first impression was that someone was fleeing the building after sheltering there. He instinctively grabbed his radio and phoned Morgan. Morgan heard someone's on the third floor, but saw no one on the hallway video. Dave had grabbed his gun and was examining the dark hallway. He didn't see runners. While waiting for Morgan to save him, he thought about two things. First, hearing the door bang didn't mean the person ran out. They may still be in the bathroom. Second, he remembered from his training that the bathroom door had a heavy-duty hydraulic hinge. That door could not close. He was aiming his revolver at the bathroom door when Morgan emerged at the top of the stairs with his weapon. They entered the bathroom and cleared every stall and corner. No one was there. There was no escape. Okay, they thought, they must have run out of the bathroom before slamming the door. They're somewhere else in the theater. They searched the entire building. They left the bathroom with pistols drawn and checked all third-floor doors. All was locked. Dave could see via the stairway door window that the second-floor lights were on as they descended. He recalled turning them off minutes earlier. "Did you turn on the second-floor lights?" Morgan shook his head. No. They assumed the bathroom occupant ran to the second level and turned them on. When they entered the second story, all the lights were on and every door was open. They searched every room, closet, and crevice. Nobody was there. They switched out all lights, locked all doors, and kept searching. Lights off, doors locked, the first floor was perfect. They descended to the basement. As they searched for an intruder, the creepiness increased. They searched every room, but found no one. Back in the control room, they reviewed third-floor surveillance footage. The camera wasn't pointed toward the restroom door, and the corridor was too dark to view. The footage only shows the practice room light flashing on and off and the door slamming loudly. They couldn't explain. They were afraid that someone was still in the building. One more thorough search yielded nothing. They gave up and left, calling it a bizarre, unexplained experience. Morgan worked alone on August 11th, 2 days later. Off day for Dave. Morgan perceived whispers from the hallway behind him while in the control room. After the door slammed, he was hypervigilant. He exited the hallway with his pistol. After he did, the whispering sound moved down the hall away from him. Nothing was visible when he peered around. He slowly walked down the corridor to the basement stairway. As he climbed the steps, he heard someone coughing from the basement. Morgan now acknowledged to being afraid. After all the strange things that had been happening, being alone in this vast, ancient theater and hearing coughing from the spooky basement was unnerving. He slowly descended the stairs with his rifle pointing ahead. He stopped coughing as he turned the corner at the bottom of the stairs. He turned on the lights and saw a long, deserted hallway. There was nothing. He checked all the doors as he walked down the corridor. Farther down the cellar, he smelled smoke. It came from a locked door next to him. He entered expecting a fire after unlocking the door. Despite the strong smoke scent, the room was empty and there was no fire. He examined the little room with the light on, but found nothing. He searched every room in the basement, convinced there was a fire. There was nothing. The smoke smell vanished as quickly as it appeared. He searched the auditorium for fires, but found none. He pondered phoning the fire department, but what would he say? He had to assume he smelled something. A few weeks later, on September 4, Dave arrived early for his shift at the theater. He spotted 3 employees speaking at the front desk when he entered. He overheard one talking about theater spirits as he passed. He was immediately intrigued. He approached the chatting man and introduced himself. Blair Fuller was the theater's senior accountant. Dave asked, "What's this about ghosts?" "I'm a security officer here, and I've seen some strange things myself." Blair invited Dave to his third-floor office to explain. "Okay," Blair said, "I've got a story for you. This happened a couple of years ago. I was right here in this office working late. It was about 9 or 10 at night, and I heard the elevator kick on. A loud elevator engine was always visible outside Blair's office. He didn't think much of it until he realized he was the only one in the building. The lights above the elevator door indicated the floor from his office window. It rose from the basement. It halted on the third floor after the first two. No one was there when the doors opened. Blair claimed he wasn't worried. He thought there was scheduled maintenance. The elevator alarm, which sounds when something blocks the entrance, went off after a while. He heard the loud ringing from his window, but saw nothing in the entryway. From his office, he walked to the elevator. He reported the temperature plummeted when he entered. The elevator was cold. He turned to face his office, and the doors closed. He said he didn't get off. It was his choice to ride. The elevator went down when the basement button lit up, obviously pressed. He wondered, what in the world is going on? The basement elevator opens. The place is empty. He entered the eerie underground hall. He shouted, "Hey, is anyone down here?" with all his courage. No one responded. Only light came from the open elevator car. He scarcely saw the piano in the hall. He looked both ways. Nothing. He was so scared that he climbed back in the elevator and repeatedly punched the third floor and door close buttons. He ascended after the doors closed. He returned to his office, closed the door, and sat, heart thumping. While trying to understand what happened, he heard a tremendous banging sound outside his office. His door opened, and he peered out. His eyes fell on a large metal filing cabinet in the entrance with all its drawers open. That was not his doing. He watched as the hefty drawers closed themselves one by one. Bang, 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 until they all closed. He tried opening a drawer to test whether it would close itself, but it didn't. Something must have closed it. He then left with his belongings. He never worked another theater night shift. Dave informed Morgan of Blair's remarks later that night. Morgan surprised him by opening up. He said, even before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched in this building. And then we had that experience with the slamming door and the lights. And just a few days ago, when I was here alone, I heard voices and someone coughing in the basement, and I smelled smoke. They were finally open about how uncomfortable they felt. Dave thought of it. My best friend, Greg, said, I'll invite him over one night. We'll tell him we're just giving him a tour, and we won't say anything about the strange stuff. We'll just see if he notices anything. If something happens, we'll have another witness to validate it. Morgan agreed with him. The next day, Dave's friend Greg came for his tour. They started in the main auditorium and went to the basement. Morgan and Dave observed an open door down the long corridor when Morgan turned on the light at the top of the stairs. They were certain that door should be locked. They pulled Greg behind them, drew their pistols, and moved down the hall to the door. The door banged in front of them as they left. 3 shocked people stared at each other. Before they could act, the doorknob rattled fiercely. A few seconds later, the rattling ceased. Dave and Morgan understood they had to enter. Greg followed them since he was afraid in the hall alone. They entered the little room with pistols drawn, but found no one. Greg exclaimed and pointed to a corner. He murmured, "Someone's sitting in the corner." After turning around, Dave and Morgan aimed their weapons at the corner, but saw nothing. "I just saw someone," Greg said. One of them said, "He was wearing a hood, like a sweatshirt." He was right there. Greg was seeing things after they brought him in to disprove the oddity. They left, locked, and headed upstairs swiftly. "I'm out of here," Greg remarked, leaving. All the weird episodes were reported, but Dave and Morgan framed them as break-ins, not hauntings. The county installed a new theater security camera system with infrared night vision. Morgan worked alone on September 15th to install the new cameras. He was in the control room testing the new equipment and seeing camera feed. An image on a television drew his attention. Main auditorium camera, The zoomed-out camera made it hard to discern if someone was sitting in a seat. He zoomed in and saw a guy seated with a hood. Morgan saw bright eyes staring at the camera as the person slowly moved its head. The figure suddenly rose, drifting toward the ceiling, disappearing. Morgan finished. He didn't probe. He didn't request assistance. He packed up, left the theater, and quit his job that day. A few weeks later, Dave worked alone at the theater. He heard a piano playing suddenly in the control room. Basement piano was the sole piano in the building. He pulled his gun and exited the control room because he had to investigate. As he approached the basement stairs, the piano music increased. As he downed the stairs, he heard the piano key's wooden cover close and the music stop just before he turned the corner into the long hallway. He turned the corner, turned on the lights, and surveyed the hall. Nobody was there. He realized he would never find anyone. Whatever haunted the theater. That satisfied Dave. He returned upstairs, locked himself in the control room until his shift ended, and left. The next day, he told his sergeant, "You can never assign me to that theater again, or I will quit." He was reassigned immediately. No full-time security officer worked at the theater for 2 months. The role was finally filled by veteran police officer Josh Thomas on November 26th. Dave drove near the theater on his first night of duty. Josh's voice suddenly rang out over the radio. "I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater." Dave already suspected otherwise. He didn't want to return, but he had to warn the new guy. Josh was standing outside a rear door, terrified, when Dave came. Josh said he heard voices in the basement while making rounds. On the third story, he observed the elevator rise from the basement by itself. It was vacant when the doors opened. When the door alarm went off unexpectedly, he called for help. Dave said, "Look, let's just search the building together." They searched the theater, but discovered nothing. Before Dave left, they were conversing on the big auditorium stage. Josh faced Dave when his back was to the audience. Josh paused, mid-sentence, transfixed, and stared at something above Dave's shoulder. "What?" asked Dave. Josh murmured, "There's something behind you." Dave carefully turned. A man stood in the dark theater's rear. He was hooded and faced away. The figure turned rapidly and faced them. Deep, dark, sunken eyes and a black, scorched face suggested it had been terribly burned. The stranger glanced at them before turning and rushing out of the theater's rear. Josh thought it was an intruder, but Dave knew better. They checked the building again, but discovered no shrouded figure. Dave sat Josh down in the control room and told him everything, his, Morgan's, and Blair's. Dave later researched the theater's history. His research revealed a devastating 1940s fire in the structure. A man trapped in the basement died in the fire. Dave, Morgan, and Josh believed they were seeing the ghost of that man still haunting his grave. 6 DeFeo family members were asleep in their beds in calm suburban Amityville, New York on the 13th of November, 1974. The 7th family member, 23-year-old Ron DeFeo Jr., was awake in his basement room. He got out of bed at 1 a.m., grabbed a powerful gun, and climbed the stairs. He reached the second-floor landing after climbing the second flight of steps. He went straight to his parents' bedroom. A little candle on his father's bedside table illuminated the room. Ron shot his father twice in the back with the rifle. After his father stopped, he shot his mother twice with the rifle. He left the room calmly and crossed the hall to his 2 younger brothers' bedroom. He fired 1 shot at his 1-2-year-old brother Mark with the weapon again. He then fired 1 shot at his 9-year-old brother John. His 3-year-old sister Allison was asleep in another bedroom down the hall when he exited their room. He shot once with the rifle. After leaving her room, he went up a 3rd set of stairs to the 3rd story, located his 8-year-old sister Dawn, and shot her 1 last time. Ron DeFeo Jr. killed his family in 15 minutes. He was calm and collected. He casually moved from room to room, taking well-aimed shots. He dropped the firearm, stepped outside, and sprinted to a neighboring pub. He raced inside and yelled that he had just returned home to discover his family shot and needed help. He refused to enter the house when bar patrons followed him. They entered and saw the horror. Ron immediately confessed, "I killed my family," to the police. Ron Jr. was the most notoriously dysfunctional DeFeo. His explosive, angry temper and extensive drug and alcohol usage were well known. People avoided him. Amityville was unsurprised when Ron was found guilty of murdering the entire family. As crime scene details emerged, folks wondered if there was more to the story. All 6 victims were found face down in their beds. None exhibited evidence of fighting their attacker. Investigators initially thought Ron drugged them before killing them. No family members had narcotics or sedatives in their systems when toxicology findings came back. This didn't bother police at first. They assumed the family in the other rooms didn't hear the gunshots. Ron utilized a .35 caliber Marlin, one of the loudest guns available. Investigators tested the identical gun inside a house and found that it could be heard from a mile away. The detectives concluded that the family heard the gunshots, which was alarming. What was happening must have been known. None got out of bed for some reason. They didn't flee, hide, or fight. All they did was wait in bed. Ron's confession was odd. He informed authorities that he heard a voice in his head while lying in his basement bed, unable to sleep the night of the murders. The voice said, "Kill them." He believed he was going crazy. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness under the basement stairs and approached him. Ron saw this creature stroll up to his bed, bend down, and whisper, "Kill them." He said he lost control of his body at that point. Involuntarily, he grabbed the gun next to his bed, rose up, and headed upstairs. He knew he was going to kill his family and didn't want to, but he had no choice. He claimed to be possessed by a basement demon. Ron's tale horrified Amityville, but a demon-possessed mansion didn't hold up in court. His 6 murder convictions earned him life in jail. The Lutz family moved into the notorious mansion a year later. After 28 days, they fled in terror, claiming supernatural forces were tormenting them, including cellar voices. After then, famous demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated the property. They swiftly confirmed the house was haunted. The Amityville house is one of the most haunted in the world. Lorraine captured a famous photo while the Warrens investigated. She was taking infrared photos on the 2nd floor near the bedroom where the 2 boys were killed. She and her husband Ed were alone in the house. One photo of the processed film showed a young boy with luminous eyes peering out of a doorway. Lorraine has long maintained the boy in the picture is 9-year-old John DeFeo's ghost. The house still stands in Amityville and has been sold many times. No one seems to like living there long. Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. In 2014, a young woman named Jen was relaxing in her sister's living room. She was watching her son and her 2 nephews playing outside in the backyard. It was a perfectly normal, quiet afternoon. As she watched them, one of her nephews, a little boy named Harrison, walked over to a big tree in the yard. He started peeling the bark off of it the way kids sometimes do, just mindlessly picking at it. For Jen, seeing this simple act triggered a strange and deeply buried childhood memory. It was something she hadn't thought about in decades. Without even meaning to, she just sort of blurted out what was on her mind. She said, "So weird." Her mother, who was in the next room, heard her. Her mom called out, "Jen, is everything okay?" "What's so weird?" Jen felt a little embarrassed. She hadn't meant for anyone to hear her talking to herself. She quickly tried to brush it off, saying, "Oh, no, sorry." It's nothing. I didn't mean to say that out loud, but it was too late. Her mom was curious now. She walked into the living room and saw Jen looking out the back window at the boys. Her mom came right up next to her and looked out too. She asked, "What are the boys doing out there? Are they getting into trouble?" Jen shook her head. No, it's not the kids. I just saw Harrison doing something that reminded me of a weird thing that happened to me when I was a kid. I just reacted to the memory, that's all. Jen's mom looked at her, totally intrigued now. She said, "Well, you can't just say that and not tell me." "What's the memory?" Jen sighed. She figured she might as well tell her. "Okay, Mom, I'll tell you. I don't know if Frankie's mom ever told you this or not, but it was back when I was 8 years old. I had called my friend Frankie, and he was busy with some homework. He told me to come over and meet him outside his house, and we could go play when he was done." She continued, painting the picture for her mom. "So I walked over to his house. I was standing across the street from his place in front of that little group of trees we used to call the Pinecone Forest. It wasn't really a forest, just a handful of trees, but that's what we called it. Anyway, I was standing there waiting, and I started peeling the bark off one of the trees. I don't even think I realized I was doing it. I was just passing the time. As Jen was talking, the memory became clearer and clearer in her mind. So I'm peeling the bark, watching Frankie's house for him to come out. And then I noticed a guy to my right, walking through the trees, coming towards me. I'd never seen him before in our neighborhood. Even before he got close, I could smell him. He just reeked of stale cigarettes. His teeth were very yellow, and he was missing a few of them. And I remember looking at his hands. I don't know why, but I did. He had these long, pointy, yellow fingernails. They looked like he was growing them out on purpose, all jagged and sharp. He walked right up to me and stopped, way too close, totally in my personal space. But he didn't look at me at first. He looked at the spot on the tree where I had been peeling the bark off. He was maybe a foot away from me. I remember having to lean back because I didn't want to be rude and just run away. All I could smell was that awful cigarette smoke. Then he turned from the tree and looked right at me. He said, "What do you think you're doing?" I was so startled, I just said, "I'm waiting for my friend." He shook his head. "No." "What are you doing to the tree?" I looked at him, then back at the tree and said, "Peeling the bark off." And that's when he reached out and pinched my arm. He didn't use the pads of his fingers. He used those long nails. He dug them into my skin, and through his gritted yellow teeth, he whispered, "How would you like it if someone peeled your skin off?" Jen paused for a moment, remembering the feeling. I was so terrified, I just froze. I was like I was in a trance. I just stood there looking at him, wondering what was going to happen next. Then, just by pure luck, Frankie's mom came out onto their porch and yelled, "Hey, come on inside." Frankie's done with his homework now. That broke the spell. I pulled my arm away and just started running across the street to Frankie's house. I looked back once, expecting him to be chasing me, but he wasn't. He was still standing there by the tree, just watching me. I ran inside, and that was it. I remember wanting to tell you about it when I got home, but for some reason, I just didn't. Then days turned into weeks, and eventually, I guess I just forgot about it. Until just now, when I saw Harrison peeling the bark off that tree, it all came rushing back. That's why I said so weird. I was just wondering who that guy was. Coden. After Jen finished her story, she expected her mom to be horrified, but also to move on pretty quickly. After all, this was an old story from 2 decades ago, and nothing bad had ultimately happened to her. But her mom's reaction was not what she expected. Her mom looked deeply concerned, almost haunted. Jen tried to downplay it. "Mom, this was forever ago." I was 8. It's not a big deal. Her mom looked down at the floor for a second, then looked back up at Jen. There was a look of pure guilt on her face. She said, "Jen, I should have told you this when it happened." But you were so young. I felt like it would ruin your childhood, so I didn't. It seemed like you forgot all about it, so I let it be. But obviously, you didn't forget. I guess you need to hear the whole story now. Jen was completely confused. What are you talking about? What whole story? Her mother looked incredibly uncomfortable now. She was wringing her hands, touching her face, just radiating anxiety. She told Jen, it's time you learned who that man really was. Before Jen could even ask another question, her mom just said, honey, please just sit down. I'll explain everything. They both sat down on the couch. Jen's mom took a deep breath, clearly struggling to start. Okay, she began. So do you remember how our old neighborhood was? How everyone knew everyone? It was such a tight-knit community. Jen nodded. Yeah, I remember. Her mom continued, well, because of that, it was really easy to spot an outsider. If a car I didn't recognize came down our street, I'd find myself looking out the window, watching to see where it was going. There was no reason to be in that neighborhood unless you lived there or were visiting someone. I was always people watching, and I know a bunch of the other moms did the same thing. One of them was Frankie's mom, Sonia. Well, on the exact same day that man approached you in 1995, that morning, Sonia happened to look out her front window. She saw a vehicle she didn't recognize. It was a white work van, the kind with no windows in the back. It was parked across the street, right near the pinecone forest. Sonia figured it was a work truck and that whoever was driving it was probably working on one of the houses. But the spot where it was parked was strange. It wasn't close to any one particular house. There were plenty of other spots to park on the street that would have been more convenient. It seemed odd to park so far away in front of that random patch of trees. That's what made her suspicious. She didn't think anything terrible was happening, she just couldn't make sense of it. So all morning, she kept going back to the window, looking out, waiting to see if anyone would go to the van, but she never saw a soul. No workers going in or out, no activity at all. It was just this empty, silent van parked across the street. By the afternoon, when still no one had claimed it, she was getting ready to call the police. Jen's mom then connected the two stories. That was the same day you and Frankie had talked on the phone. You made plans to meet up near the pinecone forest after his homework. He never told his mom about those plans. If he had, she would have told you to come straight inside and stay away from that van. But she didn't know you were going to be out there. So, sometime in the afternoon, while Sonia is about to call the police, you were already over there by the trees waiting for Frankie. Sonia looked out the window one more time, and that's when she saw it. The back two doors of the van flew open, and that man who pinched you jumped out. He started running straight into the pinecone forest. From where Sonia was standing at her front window, she could only see part of the forest. The other part, where you were, was out of her view to the right. So she turned and ran to a side window in her house. She looked out that window and saw the rest of the forest. And there you were. You were standing in front of the tree, and she saw this man sprint right up to you. She saw him pinch your arm and lean in to talk to you. That's when she ran out onto her porch and yelled for you to come inside. She told me later that she tried to sound as natural and calm as she could. She was worried that if she sounded panicked, it would not only scare you, but it might trigger the stranger to do something drastic, like grab you. She knew he'd been made. So she watched him the whole time you were running to the house to make sure he didn't chase you. As soon as you were safely inside, she told you to go play with Frankie. The moment you were out of the room, she ran around her house and locked every single door and every single window. Then she called me. We both decided we had to call the police. Even though you were safe, we had no idea who this guy was. And the way he came out of that van, it seemed like he was intentionally waiting for you. So Sonia called the police. A cruiser was sent over to the neighborhood right away. The officers found the white van exactly where she said it would be. They pulled up next to it and walked to the driver's side. And sitting inside was a man who matched the description Sonia gave them perfectly. He was acting really weird. He looked like he was on drugs or maybe drunk. Something was definitely off about him. The officers had him step out of the vehicle. They searched the front seats, but there was nothing there besides cigarette butts and old trash. There was a partition wall separating the front seats from the back of the van. They walked around to the back. And they saw that this guy had screwed a heavy-duty latch across the middle of the two back doors. There was a big padlock through it. It was an extra lock, clearly meant to keep people from getting in or maybe from getting out. The police turned to the guy and said they needed to get in the back of his van. They asked him to open it. At first, he made a bunch of excuses, saying he couldn't. But eventually, he gave in. He pulled out a keychain he was carrying. It had two distinct keys on it. He used one of them to undo the padlock. He swung the doors open and stepped back. The police shined their flashlights inside. And they couldn't believe what they were looking at. Jen's mom's voice trembled slightly as she described it. Inside that van, on every single surface in the back, were pictures of you. They were taped to the walls, to the floor, to the ceiling. Everywhere they looked, it was your face. And they weren't just recent pictures. There were at least a couple of you when you were only 6 years old. You were 8 when he approached you. So he had been following you, watching you, for at least 2 years. Also, in the back of the van were a pair of binoculars and a camera, which they assumed he was using to take the photos. But that wasn't even the worst part of it. After they arrested him, one of the officers looked closer at that keychain, the one with the key to the padlock. He noticed the other key wasn't a duplicate. It was a different, unique key. So the police went over to the guy and they showed him the key. They asked him, "What is this for?" And he told them it was for his storage locker. The police tracked down the storage facility and they went there. They used the key on the lock of his unit. It worked. They slid open the heavy metal door, and what was inside was something straight out of a nightmare. The entire storage locker, from the ceiling to the floor to all 4 walls, was completely covered in clear plastic wrap. It was all sealed up. And behind the plastic on the walls, they could see hundreds more pictures of you. In the very middle of the storage locker was a dentist's chair. It had been bolted and anchored into the concrete floor. Next to the dentist's chair was a small silver tray, the kind you see at a dentist's office. But on the tray, there weren't dental tools. There were knives, not surgical knives. They were meat cleavers and large hunting knives, crude, heavy instruments. Next to that, on a small table, was an anatomy book. He had used printouts of your face to bookmark different pages and sections of the book. He had been taking notes and highlighting passages, all of them having to do with female anatomy. In the back of the locker, there was a rotted mattress just sitting on the ground. And anchored into the back wall were heavy chains with handcuffs dangling from them. And next to the mattress were dozens of empty 5-gallon drums. When the police showed us the pictures of the inside of his van, we were so shaken up. It was awful to imagine someone watching you like that. But when they showed us the pictures of that chamber he had built inside of his storage locker, that's something I will just never get over. He clearly had a plan for you, Jen. A terrible plan. After hearing this story from her mother, Jen was a whirlwind of emotions. She was angry with her mom for keeping such a monumental secret from her for all those years. But she was also incredibly sad. Sad for her mom, who had to carry the weight of that horror, knowing what had almost happened to her child. Now that Jen was a mother herself, she could only imagine how horrible that must have been. So, the only thing she could think to do was to give her mom a hug. After they embraced, Jen pulled back and asked the question that was burning in her mind. What happened to him? Where is he now? Did he go to jail? Her mom told her that the man had confessed to stalking her. He admitted that everything in the van and the storage locker was his, and he seemed to understand the implications of what they found. But he never gave his real motives. He never explained what his actual intentions were. He was ultimately deemed criminally insane and was put into a high-security mental institution. Her mom said she had no idea if he was still alive or where he was today. That was the last she had ever heard about him. And so, Jen decided to do some of her own homework. She managed to figure out where the man was being held. She requested a meeting with him. She wanted to ask him face-to-face what he had been planning to do to her. She needed to know why. And to her surprise, he agreed to meet with her. The meeting was scheduled. But the day before it was supposed to happen, he took his own life. Jen never found out if his decision was a direct result of their impending meeting, but it certainly seemed likely. And unfortunately, that's where the story ends. She never got any more answers. It will forever end with a big, haunting question mark. What was he going to do to her, and why? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya! On the afternoon of September 27th, 1956, a 13-year-old boy named Neri Morgan was walking with his two younger brothers through a remote and dusty desert in South Australia. This vast, barren area was called Maralinga. Neri and his brothers belonged to an isolated Aboriginal tribe known as the Martu people. On this particular day, the boys were out doing what their people had done for generations. They were hunting for food to bring back to their family. Specifically, they were tracking kangaroos. Neri, being the oldest, carried a hunting spear, while his two younger brothers carried a wooden club and a traditional boomerang. For hours, they had been quietly following a specific group of kangaroos across the dry terrain. But every single time the boys got close, just as they would slow down and prepare to strike, the kangaroos would suddenly sense them and bolt away. It was incredibly frustrating, and the afternoon sun was starting to beat down on them. But they kept going because their family was relying on them for dinner. Eventually, as they continued their long trek, the kangaroos stopped. They had gathered around a small watering hole just a few dozen yards away from where the brothers were hiding. Neri looked at his brothers and knew this was their absolute best chance. The kangaroos were thirsty, and they were going to stay at that watering hole long enough for the boys to make their move. Neri quietly signaled to his younger brothers that it was time to advance. They dropped low into the dry brush, moving as silently as possible, inching closer and closer to their targets. But after taking only a few cautious steps, a strange and terrifying sound shattered the quiet of the desert. It started as a low, deep, rumbling noise vibrating through the ground from somewhere off in the distance. The brothers stopped in their tracks. Before they could even understand what was happening, the entire sky suddenly lit up. It was an impossibly bright, blinding white light, so intense that Neri had to quickly shield his eyes with his arms just to keep from being blinded. And as he was doing this, a massive, incredibly hot gust of wind came roaring through the desert. This was not a normal desert breeze. It was a violent shockwave that blasted right into them, literally lifting the brothers off their feet and slamming them hard onto the dirt. They lay there, completely disoriented, with their ears ringing and their skin burning from the sudden heat. From the ground, Neri struggled to turn his head to see what had happened to his brothers and the environment around them. He looked over in the direction of the watering hole where the kangaroos had been just moments before. And what he saw next made absolutely no sense to him. The kangaroos were literally floating high up in the air, drifting right toward them through the hazy sky, and then they suddenly dropped heavily onto the ground. A moment later, it was as if a switch had been flipped. Everything just went back to normal. The blinding white light faded, and the sky returned to its usual blue color. The deep rumbling stopped, and the hot wind died down completely. The desert was quiet once again. Except now, right in front of Neri and his brothers, lay a dozen dead kangaroos. The boys stood up, dusted the dirt off their clothes, and tried to process what they had just witnessed. They had absolutely no concept of modern technology or what could cause such a massive explosion. To them, living their isolated life, there was only one logical explanation. They looked at this incredible bounty of fresh meat lying right at their feet, and they decided this must have been a gift from God. They believed that God had literally reached down, taken the lives of these kangaroos, lifted them up, and delivered them directly to the brothers so their tribe wouldn't go hungry. Filled with gratitude, Neri and his brothers began lifting the heavy animals, carrying as many of the dead kangaroos as they possibly could manage back to their camp. When they arrived and told their people what had happened, the tribe was overjoyed. That very night, they held a massive celebration to honor this miraculous gift from God. They built a large fire, roasted the kangaroo meat, and held a giant feast. Almost everyone in the tribe ate the meat, celebrating their good fortune. But the very next morning, the celebration turned into a nightmare. When the tribe woke up, nearly everyone who had eaten the kangaroo meat was violently ill. People were vomiting uncontrollably, their bodies were covered in painful red rashes, and they were suffering from intense aches and deep internal pain. Over the next few days, some of the tribe members slowly began to recover, but many others only got worse. Soon, people from the tribe began to die, one after the other. Neri and the surviving members of the tribe immediately made the connection. They realized that whatever was killing their people was directly tied to the kangaroo meat they had eaten. Some members of the tribe who had been skeptical about the gift from God theory argued that the meat must have been poisoned. But they had no idea how it had been poisoned, or if someone had done it on purpose. For Neri and his people, this tragic event remained an unsolved mystery for over a decade. Fast forward to 11 years later, in 1967, when Neri was 24 years old. That was when representatives from the British government finally arrived in the remote areas of southern Australia near where the Martu tribe lived. It turned out these officials were there to try and clean up a massive, dangerous mess they had created years earlier. And that was when the horrifying truth was finally revealed. Those dead kangaroos that had seemingly floated through the air and dropped at the feet of Neri and his brothers were not a gift from God at all. Instead, they were the victims of a highly classified, top-secret scientific experiment. The British government had been using the Maralinga Desert to test active nuclear weapons. On that afternoon in 1956, Neri and his brothers had been standing just a few kilometers away from an active nuclear detonation site. Where they were positioned was the absolute perfect spot to experience the fringe effects of a nuclear blast. They saw the blinding flash of the detonation, they heard the deafening roar of the shockwave, and they felt the intense thermal radiation that knocked them to the ground. But because they were just far enough away, the blast wave did not kill them. It only disoriented and bruised them. However, the kangaroos at the watering hole were positioned slightly closer to the epicenter of the bomb. Because the kangaroos were closer, and because they were much smaller animals, they were completely vulnerable to the full force of the pressure wave. The shock wave had killed the kangaroos instantly, lifted them into the air, and thrown their bodies forward, landing them right in front of the boys. But the worst part was that the blast had coated the animal carcasses in highly concentrated, invisible radioactive fallout. When the tribe cooked and ate the meat, they were ingesting lethal amounts of radiation. This caused severe acute radiation sickness, which explained the sudden vomiting, the skin rashes, and the agonizing deaths. The British government kept these tests secret for years, and an unknown number of indigenous people lost their lives due to the radioactive contamination. Eventually, after the truth came out, the Australian government ended up paying $13.5 million in compensation to the Aboriginal tribes that were devastated by the nuclear tests. Neri Morgan survived the ordeal, and today he is in his 80s, still sharing this incredible and tragic story with younger generations so that the history of his people is never forgotten. Now, let's move to another afternoon, this one in the fall of 2019, in a quiet neighborhood in Knoxville, Iowa. It was around 4 in the afternoon on Saturday, October 26th, and 56-year-old Pamela Kramer was enjoying a beautiful day in her son's backyard. Pamela was a warm, family-oriented woman who worked during the week as an assistant at a nearby United States Army base. But her job was just a way to pay the bills. Her true passion in life was her family. She lived for her husband, for children, and her grandchildren. On this particular Saturday, the family had gathered in the backyard for a very special occasion. They were holding a gender reveal party for Pamela's son and his pregnant wife, who were expecting a new baby. Pamela was absolutely thrilled and could not wait to find out if she was going to have a new grandson or granddaughter. After everyone had chatted and enjoyed some food, Pamela's son announced to the guests that it was finally time for the big reveal. The guests, including Pamela and several other close relatives, got excited and backed up toward the safety of the wooden fence on the side of the yard to get a good view. Pamela pulled out her mobile phone and began recording a video. She wanted to capture every single second of this beautiful moment so she could look back on it for years to come. In the center of the yard, the family had set up a homemade device that was supposed to shoot a cloud of colored powder into the air. Blue powder would mean it was a boy, and pink would mean it was a girl. Pamela's son walked out to the middle of the lawn and leaned over the device. He turned back to the crowd, smiled, and asked if everyone was ready. Pamela gave him a big thumbs up, keeping her phone pointed directly at him. Her son then bent down and lit a fuse attached to the device. He quickly backed away, running over to stand next to his pregnant wife along the fence line with the rest of the family. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the colorful cloud to appear. But instead of a beautiful puff of colored powder, a deafening metallic explosion shattered the air. In an instant, the peaceful backyard turned into a war zone. The homemade device was not just a harmless powder launcher. The family had built the device using a thick metal cylinder which they had packed tightly with gunpowder and the colored dust, sealing the top and bottom. When the son lit the fuse, he had unknowingly created a highly volatile pipe bomb. The immense pressure of the burning gunpowder could not escape the metal pipe safely, causing the steel cylinder to rupture and violently explode. Sharp, jagged metal shrapnel was blasted in every direction at incredible speeds, flying up to 400 feet away. Some pieces of metal tore through the wooden fences of neighboring homes, while others lodged themselves into the walls of the house. Tragically, one large piece of the exploding metal flew directly toward the fence line where the family was standing. It struck Pamela directly in the head, knocking her to the ground. The backyard erupted into total chaos as family members screamed in terror and rushed to call emergency services. When the first responders arrived, they found a devastating scene. Metal debris was scattered everywhere, and Pamela was lying near the fence, having died instantly from her injuries. It was a heartbreaking tragedy that shocked the local community. Miraculously, despite the heavy shrapnel flying all over the yard and through the neighborhood, no one else was injured. Because the incident was determined to be a tragic and unintentional accident, the local authorities decided not to file any criminal charges against the family. Now, let's fast forward to another clear morning on October 30th, 2014, in Wichita, Kansas. A 54-year-old Russian pilot named Sergei Galitsky walked into the Flight Safety International building located at the Wichita National Airport. Sergei was accompanied by his personal translator. Sergei was a highly experienced pilot who had spent over 30 years flying commercial jets and helicopters back in Russia. But on this day, he was in Kansas to obtain a specific certification to fly a Cessna turboprop plane. Because he did not speak fluent English, he brought his translator along to help him communicate with the flight instructors and understand the technical training. Inside the lobby, the translator explained to the front desk clerk that Sergei was there for his scheduled training session. The clerk smiled, nodded, and went to the back of the building to locate Sergei's designated instructor. A few moments later, the clerk returned with 78-year-old Jay Ferguson. Jay was a legendary flight instructor with decades of aviation experience, known for his thoroughness and deep knowledge of aircraft. After shaking hands and greeting each other, Jay led Sergei and the translator through the security doors and deep into the state-of-the-art training facility. As they walked down the hallways, they passed several large high-tech rooms filled with millions of dollars worth of advanced aviation equipment. Eventually, Jay stopped the group in front of a massive white spherical pod that sat mounted on top of a complex hydraulic base. To an ordinary person, it looked like a high-tech simulator ride you might find at an amusement park. But to Sergey, he knew what this was. This was a professional-level flight simulator designed to perfectly mimic the flight dynamics, cockpit layout, and emergency scenarios of a real Cessna aircraft. Even though Sergey had thousands of hours of real flight experience, the aviation authority required him to complete several simulated flights in this exact pod to prove his competency before they would allow him to pilot a real Cessna. Jay opened the heavy door to the simulator pod and gestured for the men to climb inside. Sergey climbed in first and sat down in the captain's seat on the left. Jay took the co-pilot's seat on his right, and the translator sat directly behind them so he could whisper instructions into Sergey's ear. Looking out the windows of the pod, Sergey was amazed by how realistic the simulation was. High-definition screens projected a perfect, three-dimensional view of the actual runway at the Wichita National Airport. It felt exactly as if they were sitting on the tarmac, ready for takeoff. Together, Jay and Sergey began going through the rigorous pre-flight safety checklists, verifying the virtual instruments, testing the flight controls, and ensuring the radio communications were working perfectly. Once everything was verified, Jay pressed a control panel button to start the simulation. Instantly, the hydraulic base beneath the pod activated, and the entire cabin began to rumble and vibrate, perfectly mimicking the sound and feel of a powerful propeller engine roaring to life. Jay gave Sergey the signal to begin. Sergey released the parking brake, grabbed the control yoke, and pushed the throttles forward. The simulator tilted slightly backward, giving the men the physical sensation of accelerating down the runway. As they gained speed, Sergey pulled back on the yoke, and the digital scenery tilted down as they climbed high into the simulated sky. For the next several minutes, Sergey practiced maneuvering the aircraft through the virtual airspace, performing turns, climbs, and descents. The flight simulator's advanced hydraulics moved the pod in perfect synchronization with Sergey's inputs, making the flight feel incredibly lifelike. Jay watched closely, occasionally speaking into his headset, with the translator quickly relaying the instructions to Sergey in Russian. Sergey adjusted quickly to the Cessna's sensitive controls, and Jay was highly impressed by the Russian pilot's smooth handling of the aircraft. It was clear that Sergey was going to easily pass his certification test. After completing all the required maneuvers, Jay decided it was time to bring the session to a close and have Sergey perform a landing back at the airport. Sergey turned the simulated plane around, lined it up with the virtual runway, and began his final descent. He carefully managed his speed and altitude, bringing the plane down smoothly toward the asphalt. Everything was going perfectly. Sergey brought the nose up slightly, preparing for a soft landing. But the exact microsecond the virtual tires of the simulator touched down on the digital runway, a massive, deafening crash shattered the silence of the room, and everything instantly went black. At that very same moment, people standing outside on the tarmac and near the airport buildings heard a terrifying, thunderous explosion. They spun around and saw a thick, black column of smoke and giant flames shooting out from the roof of the Flight Safety International building. Bystanders immediately called 911 as sirens began to wail across the airport. When the firefighters and emergency crews arrived on the scene, they were shocked by the scale of the destruction. Part of the building's roof and walls had been completely pulverized, and a raging fire was consuming the interior. It would turn out that while Sergey, Jay, and the translator were inside the dark simulator pod, another pilot named Mark Goldstein was taking off from the very same airport in a real twin-engine passenger plane. Shortly after takeoff, Mark's real plane suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure, causing him to lose complete control of the aircraft. The plane veered wildly off course, plunged toward the ground, and crashed directly through the roof of the Flight Safety International building. By an almost impossible and tragic coincidence, the crashing plane struck the exact room and the exact simulator pod where Sergey and his team were conducting their training. The violent impact and the subsequent fuel explosion instantly killed the pilot of the real plane, Mark, as well as Jay, Sergey, and his translator inside the simulator. It was a bizarre and tragic event that sent shockwaves through the aviation community. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Sometimes reality is far more unpredictable and unsettling than any fiction we could write. We like to think we have a firm grip on our lives, that our spaces are safe, and that the people around us are exactly who they claim to be. But every now and then, a series of events shatters that illusion. Today, we're going to look at 3 different stories that show just how fragile our understanding of the world really is. In one case, a man lives for decades unaware of a danger lurking in his chest. In another, a brilliant mind gets caught up in international espionage, ending up in a situation so bizarre investigators still argue about it today. And in our final story, a normal afternoon turns into a struggle for survival, where tragic miscommunications lead to a heartbreaking end. These stories remind us that danger, mystery, and the unimaginable are often hiding just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. Let's start in 2013 with a 46-year-old man named Paul Baxter. Paul was an ordinary guy who lived a relatively quiet life, but one day he started feeling a little under the weather. It began with a slight tickle, but over a couple of days it escalated into a massive cough. This wasn't a normal cold. It was a deep, chest-racking cough that became so constant, Paul could barely speak. Every time he tried to form a sentence, he would descend into another fit of coughing. Seeing that this was not getting any better, Paul decided to go see his doctor. The doctor listened to Paul's chest, heard the congestion, and quickly diagnosed him with pneumonia. This seemed like a very logical explanation, so the doctor put Paul on a treatment plan, which included a course of antibiotics and some rest. But after several months of being on this plan and not having his condition improve at all, his doctor referred him to a respiratory clinic. At the clinic, the specialists did an X-ray of his chest, and they discovered a suspicious shadow in the lower right section of his lung. Doctors were concerned, especially given the fact that Paul was a long-term smoker. They worried it could be cancer, but before they put him under the knife to cut this shadow out, they decided they would take a probe with a camera on the end of it, feed it down into his lungs, and actually have a look around inside. During the procedure, which Paul was awake for, the doctor put the probe down into that shadow area in his lung, and right away he saw a distinct lump. But when he zoomed in with his camera on the lump itself, he saw there was something orange sticking out of it. He told Paul there were little pincers at the end of this probe, and he was going to try to move the tissue around to see what this thing was, and if it was a foreign object, he would try to pull it out. But when he tried to move the tissue to get a better look, he couldn't get it dislodged, so he pulled the probe out and told Paul he would need to come back in a couple of days. Paul looked at the doctor, completely bewildered, and asked what that orange thing inside of his lung could possibly be. The doctor said he honestly had no idea, but it was definitely not supposed to be in there. A few days later, Paul went back in for this follow-up procedure. The doctor, using a longer and more powerful probe, was able to go down and actually dislodge this orange thing from inside of his lung. As soon as he pulled it free, everyone in the room watched the camera screen in real time. It was a small, triangular orange thing that nobody recognized. Finally, the pincers came out of Paul's mouth, revealing what it was holding on to, and nobody could believe what they were looking at. It was a small, plastic, orange traffic cone from a child's play toy set. As soon as Paul saw it, a memory came rushing back to him. He told the doctors that when he was 7 years old, he had inhaled a tiny toy traffic cone, but he thought he had swallowed it. Somehow, for over 40 years, he had lived with no symptoms at all, until his body finally reacted to it. Paul said that when he had this sudden revelation in front of the doctors, there was a moment of silence, and then everybody just started cracking up laughing. None of the doctors had ever seen anything like it before. Paul was allowed to keep his tiny orange traffic cone, and after he left, his cough went away and he went back to normal. But the problem was, how could someone live with plastic in their lung for over 40 years without noticing? The specialists realized that because Paul was so young, his airway adapted to the plastic. Tissue grew around it, forming a lump that kept it isolated. It was only when he grew older and his lungs changed from smoking that the tissue became irritated, triggering the cough that led to the discovery. Our second story takes us to the United Kingdom, and it involves a man named Gareth Williams. From the time Gareth was a young boy, his parents knew he was extremely gifted. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors mathematics degree from a university in his hometown of Wales. A couple of years after that, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester in England, and after that, he was accepted into a postgraduate course at Cambridge. But he wouldn't finish that degree because his incredible academic achievements had got the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, GCHQ, which is one of Britain's main intelligence agencies, offered him a job as a codebreaker. He eagerly accepted, dropped out of Cambridge, and moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, where GCHQ is located. There, he would live and work for the next 10 years. Gareth was an intensely private and shy person, but he was a highly valued team player whose genius helped his group win several top awards. In 2009, Britain's famous secret intelligence service, MI6, was so impressed with Gareth that they offered him a job. This was a rare chance for Gareth to go operational and become a real-life spy. He jumped at the chance, but shortly after moving to London, he regretted his decision. He absolutely hated the intense competitiveness within MI6, the flashy cars, the flashy lifestyles, and the pressure to go out and party with your coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and then be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody cared that he was quiet, but at MI6, this behavior made him an outsider. He eventually decided to transfer back to GCHQ, but before he left, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation was over, he didn't come back to work at his office in London, and for some reason, MI6 never checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called police after not hearing from him that anyone looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer went to Gareth's apartment in London to do a welfare check. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer, the officer got the key from the landlord and went inside. He yelled out for Gareth, but there was no sign of him on the first floor. He went upstairs, still calling for him. When he got to the second floor, he found a closed bathroom door. What he found on the other side of that door would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he walked into a bathroom, and in the bathtub, there was a big red zippered duffel bag. Inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut on the outside, and the key to this padlock was lying directly underneath Gareth's body inside of the bag. There were absolutely no fingerprints anywhere in the bathtub, on the bag itself, on the zippers, on the padlock, or on the keys. Gareth's iPhone had been found nearby on a table, and it had been completely reset to factory settings. Investigators would later determine that his phone had been reset on August 15th, which was the last day Gareth was seen on street security cameras, and also the day they believe he died. According to the coroner, Gareth's body had no injuries on it, there was no sign of a struggle, and his toxicology report showed no drugs or alcohol in his system. But the thermostat inside the apartment was turned way up, making it extremely hot inside despite it being the height of summer in August. This excessive heat sped up the decomposition process, which made it impossible for the coroner to precisely determine a cause of death. Despite a lengthy investigation by police, there was never a conclusive determination as to what happened to Gareth although there are many theories. Some say the Russian mafia killed him because right before he died, he had been focusing on money laundering in Britain that was tied to the Russian mob, which would have made him a target. Another theory is that MI6 had something to do with Gareth's death, which is why they were not so eager to go looking for him when he didn't come back from his vacation. In fact, one former MI6 agent believed there was a cover-up. He stated that it looked like MI6 had gone into Gareth's apartment ahead of the police and wiped it down, removing all fingerprints and DNA. The last prominent theory is that Gareth did this to himself. It was discovered that he made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least once he had to yell out to his landlord to help get him out of his bed because he had tied his wrists to the bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. But when two experts who were a part of the investigation attempted to put themselves inside of a similar-sized duffel bag and lock it with the padlock on the outside, they couldn't do it, despite trying over 400 times. And even if Gareth could have somehow physically got himself inside of this bag and locked it from the outside, how could he have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, the lock, the zippers, or the tub? When he was found, he didn't have gloves on. Ultimately, despite the massive red flags, Gareth's death was determined to be probably an accident, and the case was closed 3 years after his body was found. But for his family, the unanswered questions still linger. They have always maintained that a brilliant mind like Gareth, who was working on highly sensitive international security operations, was likely targeted by professionals who knew exactly how to make a murder look like an impossible self-inflicted accident. On the afternoon of April 10, 2018, 16-year-old Kyle Plush had just finished classes at Seven Hills High School in Cincinnati, Ohio. He walked out the school's doors and began walking straight across towards the sophomore parking lot where his car, a gold Honda Odyssey minivan, was located. Although Kyle had suffered a spinal cord injury at a young age, he made a remarkable recovery. He ran, biked, swam, and played soccer. But tennis was his favorite. He had joined the high school tennis team and become one of their best players. That afternoon, he had a match scheduled, so he needed to get into his minivan and get out his tennis racket and his tennis shoes. He made it to the vehicle a little bit after 3 in the afternoon, slid open the door, threw his backpack inside, and then climbed toward the third row seat of the van where his sneakers were sitting. He got to the third row, turned around, and sat down facing the front of the minivan. He took off his school shoes, put on his tennis shoes, and then he got up onto his knees and turned around so he was facing the back of the van. His knees were on the third row seat, and he began reaching down into the trunk well to reach for his bag that contained his tennis racket. As he was reaching, the third row seat itself, which he was kneeling on, suddenly flipped backwards, dumping him headfirst into the trunk. Except all of Kyle's body did not just go tumbling into the trunk space. Tinma, his upper half, made it about halfway down, and then he got stuck upside down when the top of that heavy third row seat caught his chest and pressed it tightly up against the back hatch of the van. Kyle was completely upside down, and his hands were free in the trunk space, but they were too close to the floor where he couldn't really press himself out of this position. This third row seat had come loose, and because it was not locked in position, if he tried to move up at all, the seat went with him, and if he came down, the seat came with him too. Even trying to push himself back out again was impossible because he couldn't clear the seat. He probably looked for places to pull himself down, hoping that might be a way to clear the obstruction, but there was nothing to grab onto, and his lower half would not have been able to slip through that gap, even if the seat was stationary. No person is supposed to get through that tiny little gap, and there was also no inside handle on the back hatch that Kyle could have grabbed to potentially open the door. He was entirely reliant on somebody showing up and opening the trunk from the outside. But the scariest part of this situation was that loose third row seat weighed nearly 100 pounds, and it was driving directly against his chest, crushing his lungs with every passing second. He would have had to fight with every single breath he took, pushing up against that 100 pounds just to get a marginal gasp of air. Worse than that, if Kyle didn't constantly put air into his chest and keep it full and strong, that seat would literally crush his chest and kill him. Kyle knew he had to find a way to signal someone that he was in this car. He couldn't reach his phone because it was up in his pants pocket, and trying to reach it meant getting around the seat, which he couldn't do. But he had a smartphone, and he knew he could use voice-assisted calling. At 3:14 in the afternoon, he used his iPhone's voice assistant, Siri, to call 911. As soon as the dispatcher picked up, Kyle was frantic, yelling for help, saying he was trapped in a minivan in the Seven Hills parking lot, and someone needed to get him out. But the dispatcher couldn't really understand what Kyle was saying because he was yelling from deep inside the trunk space up to his phone in his pocket. The dispatcher was just having a hard time understanding him, although if you listen to the audio, it is plainly clear that Kyle is in extreme distress. You can hear him yelling and you can hear him banging on the inside of the car. The dispatcher kept asking where he was, but Kyle couldn't hear his phone, so he just kept frantically repeating his situation, saying his name, where he was located, and what was happening to him, hoping that someone on the other end of the line would understand and come save him. Toward the end of the call, Kyle tells the dispatcher that he thinks he is going to die here, and when the call cuts out, the dispatcher tries calling back, but it goes straight to voicemail. The voicemail only indicated his name was Kyle. Not knowing if this was real or a hoax, the dispatcher wrongly labeled the call as unknown trouble when they broadcasted it to the police, and they did not communicate that the caller was obviously in distress, screaming and banging. Had the dispatcher given Kyle's call a higher priority, fire and rescue would have been alerted, and they could have used their advanced mapping technologies to pinpoint where his cell phone was. Instead, local police were sent to the Seven Hills High School area to look around the different parking lots. But there was nearly a dozen of these parking lots associated with the school, making it a huge search area. And again, these police officers were not even aware of what they were looking for. They were looking for unknown trouble associated with some caller somewhere around this huge high school. The police showed up and began kind of meandering through the parking lots, staying inside their patrol vehicles and just looking around. They didn't see any obvious problems, although in reality, they were right near Kyle's gold minivan the entire time. At 3:35, with the police still patrolling the parking lots, Kyle used Siri to call 911 again, and a different dispatcher answered. At this point, it had been 21 minutes since his first call, and the weight of that heavy seat was becoming unbearable. His voice was very weak and faint. You can tell he had highly labored breathing, and every word was punctuated with a long silence as he tried to get out anything he could to help himself. He told the dispatcher, "If I die, I need you to tell my mother that I love her." There was a long silence, and Kyle asked them if they could hear him. He told them this was not a joke, that he was trapped in his gold minivan in the Seven Hills sophomore parking lot, and if they didn't get there soon, he was going to die. He kept saying, hey Siri," trying to keep the phone active, but then it went completely silent. The second dispatcher heard Kyle on this call, but for some reason did not relay to the patrolling officers Kyle's dire situation or his exact position. They didn't tell the officers that he was in a gold Honda Odyssey in the sophomore parking lot. That critical information was never communicated, and so just 2 minutes after the second call ended, the officers left the school thinking there was no trouble. Kyle was left entirely alone in the dark. 6 hours later, Kyle's father went out looking for him after he didn't come home from his tennis match. He used an iPad tracking application to locate his son's phone, which pointed him directly to the school. He drove there and found the gold minivan parked in the sophomore parking lot. But when he ran up and opened the vehicle, it was already too late. His son was still trapped upside down in the trunk space, and he had passed away after the heavy seat finally crushed his chest, causing him to asphyxiate. The medical examiner later confirmed that the heavy seat had slowly compressed his chest, preventing him from breathing, and he had died of positional asphyxiation. Kyle's family was absolutely devastated by the tragic loss of their son, and they filed a major wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Cincinnati and several employees involved. They sought to ensure that such a catastrophic breakdown in the emergency system would never happen to another family again. The legal proceedings and the fight for accountability would continue for years, leaving a deep, lingering sadness over the entire high school community and a tragic, permanent reminder of how a series of small, avoidable human errors can lead to the loss of an extraordinary young life filled with so much potential. Some mysteries eventually get answers. Others never do. And of the 3 stories you heard today, at least one still leaves more questions than answers. If stories like these fascinate you, there's another unbelievable true case waiting in the next video. Go check it out and see if you can figure that one out before the experts did. On the morning of Sunday, the 17th of June, 2018, a 35-year-old man named Tristan Baudet woke up early. The first thing he did was grab his phone to check the weather forecast for Orange County, California. Orange County is a sprawling, beautiful suburb nestled between the massive cities of Los Angeles and San Diego. It was here that Tristan, his 36-year-old wife, Erica Wu, and their 2 little girls, who were just 2 and 4 years old, had built their life. And on this particular morning, which just so happened to be Father's Day, Tristan was hoping for good news. He had a plan. He wanted to take his whole family out for a perfect day at the beach to celebrate. He watched as the weather app loaded on his phone and a smile spread across his face. The forecast was for clear skies and sunshine all day. But honestly, even if the app had predicted rain and cold, Tristan probably would have tried to convince everyone to go to the beach anyway. For Tristan, being outdoors was his happy place. It didn't matter if it was hiking in the mountains, camping under the stars, or just tossing a frisbee in a park. If he was outside, he was content. This love for nature was something he had already passed down to his 2 young daughters. They were his little adventure sidekicks, always eager to explore the world with their dad. It made Tristan incredibly happy to see them falling in love with the same things he did. His wife, Erica, she enjoyed the outdoors too, but maybe not with the same level of passion as Tristan. But that was perfectly fine with him. Tristan was the kind of person who just went with the flow. He would make small adjustments to make sure she was comfortable. For instance, whenever they went camping, he was happy to rough it in a tent on the hard ground. But he would always pack a big, full-sized inflatable mattress just for Erica. And it wasn't just about the mattress. It was about his entire personality. Erica adored him for it. He was just so easygoing and accepting of people as they were. He never judged anyone. He was just at peace with the world. In fact, that exact quality was what first drew Erica to him all those years ago. They had met back in high school. Some mutual friends had set them up because Tristan needed a date for a school dance. Erica agreed to go with him, and the night of the dance was the first time she ever laid eyes on him. And he was quite a sight. Over the summer, he had shot up a few inches in height, but hadn't quite filled out yet, so he was tall and very lanky. And for this dance, he was completely overdressed in a full tuxedo, but he wasn't self-conscious about it at all. He was just genuinely excited to be there with a date. And all night long, Tristan owned that tuxedo, dancing with all his lanky, gangly glory as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He made it his mission to make sure Erica had a great time, and she absolutely did. After that night, the 2 of them were pretty much inseparable. Their lives took them on impressive paths. Erica went on to study at Stanford University and became a successful OBGYN doctor. Tristan became a brilliant and widely published scientist. He even held a patent related to vaccine delivery. On paper, his resume was unbelievable, stacked with achievements, but all that success never changed the core of who Tristan was. His colleagues at the lab, who all loved him, found it hilarious. Here was this genius chemist working on cutting-edge cancer treatments, a guy doing incredibly complex research, who was also this laid-back person who walked around the lab starting most of his sentences with the word dude. By early afternoon on that Father's Day, the Bodette family had made their way to a local beach. Erica settled into a beach chair with a book, while Tristan and the two little girls set up a sunshade right at the edge of the water. They started digging in the sand, building little castles. Every so often, Erica would look up from her book and watch them. She'd see them laughing as they dug. Then they'd suddenly abandon their project and run into the shallow surf, shrieking with delight as they tried to outrun these small, gentle waves that crashed around their ankles. At one point, Erica looked up and saw her daughters having the time of their lives, and then she saw Tristan look over at her. He flashed her this huge, happy grin. And in that one single moment, watching her family, Erica felt a sense of pure contentment wash over her. It was a feeling that didn't always come easily to her. Unlike Tristan, who could just relax and enjoy life as it came, Erica was a constant worrier. This anxiety traced all the way back to when she was just 8 years old. That was the year she lost her father. It was a deeply traumatic event that had devastated her family and cast a long shadow over her childhood. Ever since then, she had lived with a persistent, quiet fear that no matter how good things were, something terrible was always just around the corner, waiting to ruin it all. But sitting there on the beach, seeing that smile on her husband's face, and hearing the laughter of her children, that fear melted away. It was a perfect moment. So Erica put her book down, got up from her chair, and ran to join her family in the water. She had no way of knowing that her deepest fear was about to become a reality. 4 days later, on Thursday, June 21st, the atmosphere at their home was very different. Erica was trying to study for a huge medical exam she was scheduled to take the very next day. But with Tristan and their two energetic daughters at home, the house was loud and chaotic. It was impossible for her to focus. Tristan could see the stress on her face. He also knew that on top of the exam, they were only a week away from a massive life change. They were moving to San Francisco. They had already put a deposit down on a new house up there, closer to some of their family. It was a good move for them, but it added another huge layer of pressure. Looking at his wife, Tristan knew she needed a break. She needed some peace and quiet to study and prepare. And so, he came up with a plan. He decided he would take the girls and get out of the house for the weekend. He made a couple of quick phone calls. A little while later, he went to Erica and told her what he had arranged. He had booked a campsite up in Malibu, California. Malibu is another one of those iconic Southern California towns about an hour-and-a-half drive north of Orange County. It's known for being a wealthy enclave where celebrities live, and he told her that he had also called his brother-in-law, Scott, who had 2 young sons of his own, ages 3 and 5. The plan was for all of them to go camping together for the weekend. Erica was incredibly grateful. She really did need the time and space to study. But at the same time, a familiar sense of worry started to creep in. Tristan often took the girls on little adventures, but he had never taken them camping overnight by himself without her there. Her first instinct was to object, to say it wasn't a good idea. But Tristan, who knew his wife so well, reassured her. He told her not to worry. He promised he would take great care of the kids. He explained that it was a very public, well-known campground with lots of other people around. He promised it was totally safe. Eventually, Erica was convinced. So Tristan started packing up the car. He loaded in all the camping gear, the kids' toys, and their little bikes. As he worked, the girls were buzzing with excitement about their big camping trip. But Erica couldn't shake a bad feeling. A part of her was silently hoping that something would happen and they would have to cancel the trip. She just felt like something bad was about to happen. But nothing happened to stop them. After the car was all packed and the girls were buckled into their car seats, Tristan came over to Erica. He gave her a kiss goodbye and told her he'd see her in a couple of days. He wished her good luck on her test. And with that, he got into the driver's seat, backed out of the driveway, and headed up the road towards Malibu. Erica stood and watched until the car disappeared from sight. That night, Erica studied late into the evening before finally going to bed. The next morning, she woke up early. She was feeling anxious about the test, and she was still worried about Tristan and the girls. As she was getting ready for her day, she heard a loud, insistent knock on her front door. She glanced at the clock. It was only 6:45 in the morning. It made no sense. No one should be knocking on her door at this hour. Maybe it was Tristan, but if it were him, he would have just used his key. Apprehensively, she walked to the front of the house and opened the door. The moment she saw who was standing on her porch, she knew. She knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Erica would later look back on that moment opening the door. And even though it was irrational, she would sometimes think to herself, what if I had just never opened the door? Would this nightmare still have happened? But she did open the door, and standing there was her sister-in-law, Priscilla. Priscilla lived an hour and a half away and was completely unannounced. Her face was frantic and tear-streaked. And then Priscilla gave Erica the most heartbreaking news a person could ever receive. The words were so shocking, so world-shattering, that Erica's mind literally could not process them. She kept thinking, this can't be true. There has to be a mistake. But there was no mistake. Erica would not be taking her medical exam that day. Instead, she got into the car with Priscilla, and they began the long, silent drive to Malibu. The day before, Tristan and his two little girls had arrived at the entrance to Malibu Creek State Park. When you think of Malibu, you probably picture mansions on the beach. But just inland from the coast, the landscape changes dramatically. It becomes rugged and wild, full of deep canyons and dense forests. And nestled right in the middle of all this wilderness is the state park. Tristan and his brother-in-law Scott pulled up to the gate, checked in with the park rangers, and were given directions to their campsites. They had reserved 2 spots right next to each other. A campsite in a place like this is usually just a simple, square plot of dirt, maybe with a fire pit. It's just enough space to pitch a tent. So Tristan and Scott drove across the campground to their assigned spots. But as soon as they got there, Tristan realized the spots weren't very good. They were located right next to the portable toilets, so there was a bit of a smell, and a lot of people were walking back and forth. The ground was also on a slight slope, which would make sleeping uncomfortable. It just wasn't ideal. Scott agreed, so he decided to go back and talk to the rangers to see if they could move. He drove back to the entrance, spoke with a ranger, and it turned out to be no problem at all. The ranger told him there were 2 other open sites on the far side of the park, and they could just swap their reservation. So Tristan and Scott packed everything back up and drove over to the new spots. And these ones were perfect. They were tucked away at the base of a huge sloping canyon wall, far from any bathrooms or foot traffic. It felt private and secluded, and the ground was perfectly flat. The 2 men were thrilled. They started unloading their cars and setting up their tents, while the 4 kids ran around playing and riding their small bikes. Once the tents were up, they built a fire in the fire pit, which was situated right between the 2 campsites. Scott would be sleeping in his tent with his 2 sons, and Tristan would be in his tent with his 2 daughters. As the sun went down, they all gathered around the fire. They roasted hot dogs and made s'mores, that classic camping treat of marshmallows, chocolate, so graham crackers. The dads told funny jokes and some not too spooky stories. Before long, all 4 kids were completely exhausted. So Scott and Tristan each took their own children and tucked them into their sleeping bags inside the tents. After the kids were settled, the 2 men came back out to the fire. Tristan had brought some pre-made cocktails, and he shared one with Scott. They sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet of the night and each other's company. Tristan talked a lot about the upcoming move to San Francisco, and Scott was happy to just sit and listen. Eventually, they were both tired too. They decided it was time to call it a night. They carefully put out the fire. Scott gave Tristan a hug and told him he loved him. Then the two men went to their separate tents. As Scott climbed into his tent with his sleeping sons, he looked across the now dark fire pit towards Tristan's tent. He could just make out the silhouette of Tristan climbing inside with his girls. After seeing that, Scott zipped up his own tent, lay down, and within about 15 minutes, he was fast asleep. Just before sunrise the next morning, around 4:45 a.m., Scott suddenly woke up. He thought he had heard a loud noise, but he was groggy and couldn't quite place what it was. He lay there in the dark, listening. And as he got his bearings, he realized that one of Tristan's daughters was crying in the other tent. Now, this wasn't immediately alarming. Kids cry. He figured Tristan would comfort her in a minute and she would go back to sleep. But the crying didn't stop. It just continued. Scott knew that Tristan was a notoriously heavy sleeper, so he started to think, okay, maybe he just hasn't woken up yet. That must be why he's not calming his daughter down. So Scott carefully got out of his sleeping bag, trying not to wake his own sons. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The air was cold, and it was still dark. He couldn't see anything inside of Tristan's tent. He walked over to it, and by the time he got there, he could hear Tristan's daughter still crying, clear as day. Scott called out in a loud whisper, "Hey, Tristan. Tristan, wake up!" But there was no response. Nothing. With the little girl still crying just on the other side of the thin nylon wall, Scott decided he had to look inside. He walked around to the front of the tent, found the zipper, and pulled it open. He peered inside, but it was too dark to see clearly. But even in the dim pre-dawn light, he could make out the shapes. He could see Tristan lying still in the middle of the tent. On either side of him were his two daughters. It looked like the 2-year-old was the one who was crying, and the 4-year-old was awake too, whimpering and trying her best to comfort her little sister. As Scott was trying to figure out what was going on, the two little girls turned and looked up at him. When they saw him, they both started saying the same word over and over. Wet. 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 Scott had no idea what they meant. He was starting to feel a surge of panic. He knew something was very wrong. He reached into the tent and started shaking Tristan's shoulder, saying, "Hey, wake up," but the second he touched him, he knew. He knew instantly. Tristan wasn't sleeping. Tristan was dead. And his two little girls were sitting right next to him in a pool of his blood. Just before Scott had woken up, someone somewhere nearby in the darkness of the park had fired a gun. One of the bullets from that gun had traveled through the night, pierced the thin wall of Tristan's tent, and had struck him directly in the head as he slept peacefully between his two daughters. About 2 hours after that, Priscilla arrived on Erica's doorstep to tell her what had happened. To tell her that her husband was gone and that her two little girls were now going to grow up without a father, just like she did. The news didn't just break Erica's heart, it completely shattered her world. A 42-year-old man named Anthony Rauda was eventually arrested and charged with Tristan's murder. Rauda had a long and violent criminal history, and at the time of the shooting, he was living illegally off the grid deep in the canyons of that very same park. When police finally caught up to him, he was in possession of a rifle. And ballistics tests later confirmed that it was the same rifle that had fired the bullet that killed Tristan. His trial has been a long and difficult process. It's been repeatedly delayed because Rauda keeps firing his defense attorneys. Although he insists that he is innocent, his behavior in court has done nothing to help his case. He has been so violent and erratic during his court appearances that he has to be strapped into a special chair by his wrists and legs. They even have to put a device called a spit hood over his head to stop him from spitting at or biting people. Assuming that he was the shooter, which the evidence strongly suggests he was, the motive appears to be completely random. It's believed he didn't know Tristan at all. He just, for whatever reason, fired his gun that night. Maybe he was firing recklessly into the darkness, or maybe he intentionally aimed at the tent. We don't know for sure. But either way, one of his bullets found its target, and Tristan Baudet was killed simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if the story wasn't already tragic enough, one more detail emerged that made it even more distressing. Tristan's death was not the first shooting to happen in or around Malibu Creek State Park. In the year leading up to his murder, there had been an astounding 6 other shootings in the immediate area. And 2 of those shootings happened inside the very same campground where Tristan was killed. None of those other shootings had been fatal, but in all 6 cases, the person or people responsible were never caught. And it seemed the local police hadn't put much effort into investigating them. It wasn't until a father was killed in his tent next to his children that the stories of all these other unsolved shootings finally came to light. People started looking at a map and connecting the dots. They realized there was a pattern. There was a rogue shooter who had been active in that exact area for a year, and the public had never been warned. The campground was never closed. No one was told that there was a potential danger lurking in the wilderness there. And the big question everyone had was, why? We may get answers to those questions during Anthony Rauda's trial, where he's being charged not only with Tristan's murder, but for all those other shootings as well. In the meantime, Erica has filed a $90 million lawsuit against several government agencies. Her lawsuit argues that her husband had no idea about the threat that existed in that park. If the authorities had just put up a single sign, a single warning to the public, Tristan, being the protective father he was, would have never ever taken his children there. And he would still be alive today. That lawsuit is still ongoing. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.